Chapter 21 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 21. The Moth Meets the Star. Thus had Aline, her heart hot for battle in Jimmie's cause, contrived with Connie Deering as subsidiary conspirator. She had lain awake most of the night, thinking of the approaching interview, composing speeches, elaborating arguments, defining her attitude. Her plan of campaign was based on the assumption of immediate hostilities. She had pictured a scornful lady moved to sudden anger at seeing herself trapped and haughtily refusing to discuss overtures of peace. It was to be war from the first, until she had brought her adversary low, and when the door handle rattled and the door opened to admit Norma, every nerve in her young body grew tense, and her heart beat like the clapper of a bell. Norma entered, looked for a moment in smiling surprise at Aline, came quickly forward, and moved by a sudden impulse, a yearning for love, sweetness, freshness, peace, she knew not what, she put her arms round the girl and kissed her. "My dear Aline, how sweet it is to see you again." The poor little girl stood helpless. The bottom was knocked out of her half-childish plan of campaign. There was no scornful lady, no haughty words, no hostilities. She fell to crying. What else could she do? There, don't cry, dear," said Norma soothingly, almost as helpless. Seating herself on a low chair and drawing Aline to her side, she looked up at the piteous face. "Why should you cry, dear?" "I didn't know you'd be so good to me," answered Aline, wiping her eyes. "Why shouldn't I be good to you? What reason could I have for not being glad to see you?" "I don't know," said the girl with a touch of bitterness. "Things are so different now." Norma sighed for answer and thought of her premonition. She was aware that Connie had deliberately planned this interview, but could find no resentment in her heart. The reproach implied in Aline's words she accepted humbly. She was at once too spiritless for anger, and too much excited by the girl's presence for regret at having come. Her eye fell upon the picture leaning against the chair back, and a conjecture swiftly passed through her mind. "Mrs. Deering asked me to come and look at a wedding present," she said with a smile. "Did she tell you from whom?" asked Aline, thrusting her handkerchief into her pocket. She found her nerve again. "No, it's from Jimmie." "Is it that over there?" Aline caught and misinterpreted an unsteadiness of voice. She threw herself on her knees by Norma's side. "You won't refuse it, Miss Hardacre. Oh, say you won't refuse it. Jimmie began it ever so long ago. He put everything into it. It would break his heart if you refused it. The heart of the best and beautifulest and tenderest and most wonderful man God ever made." Norma touched with her gloved fingers a wisp of hair straying over the girl's forehead. "How do you know he is all that?" "How do I know? How do I know the sun shines and the rain falls? It's just so." "You have faith, my child," said Norma oddly. "It isn't faith, it's knowledge. You all believe Jimmie has done something horrible. He hasn't. I know he hasn't. He couldn't. He couldn't harm a living creature by word or deed. I know he never did it. If I'd thought so for one moment I should have loathed myself so that I would have gone out and killed myself. I know very little about it. I didn't read the newspapers. It's hideous. It's horrible. Jimmie would as soon think of torturing a child. It's not in his nature. He's all love and sweetness and chivalry. If you say he's taken the blame on himself for some great generous purpose, yes, that's Jimmie. That's Jimmie all over. It's cruel. It's monstrous for anyone who knows him to think otherwise." She had risen from her knees halfway through her passionate speech, and moved about in front of Norma, wringing her hands. She ended in a sob and turned away. Norma lay back in her chair, pale and agitated. The cynical worldling with his piercing vision into men, and the pure, ignorant child had arrived at the same conclusion, not after months of thought, but instantly, intuitively. She could make the girl no answer. Aline began again. "He couldn't. You know he couldn't. It's something glorious and beautiful he has done, and not anything shameful." She went on with little pauses, hurling her short, breathless sentences across the space that separated her from Norma, forgetful of everything save the wrong done to Jimmie. At last Norma rose and went to her. "Hush, dear," she said. "There are some things I mustn't talk about. I daren't. You are too young to understand. Mr. Padgate has sent me a wedding present. Tell him how gladly I accepted it, and how I shall value it. Let me see the picture." Aline, her slight bosom still heaving with the after-storm of emotion, said nothing, but drew the cloth from the canvas. Norma started back in surprise. She had not anticipated seeing her own portrait. "Oh, but it is beautiful!" she cried involuntarily. "Yes, more than beautiful," said Aline, and mechanically she moved the chair into the full light of the window. Norma looked at the picture for a long time, stepped back and looked at herself in the mirror of the overmantel, and returned to the picture. And as she looked, the soul behind the picture spoke to her. The message delivered, she glanced at Aline. "It is not I, that woman. I wish to God it were." She put her hands up to her face and took a step or two across the room and repeated a little wildly, "I wish to God it were." "It is very, very like you," said Aline softly, recovering her girl's worship of the other's stately beauty. Norma caught her by the arm and pointed to the portrait. "Can't you see the difference?" But the soul behind the picture had not spoken to Aline. There was love hovering around the pictured woman's lips. Happy tenderness and trust and promise mingled in her eyes. In so far as the shadow of a flower-like woman's passion could strain her features, so were her features strained. Yet she looked out of the canvas, a proud, queenly woman, capable of heroisms and lofty sacrifice. She was one who loved deeply and demanded love in return. She was warm of the flesh, infinitely pure of the spirit. The face was the face of Norma, but the soul was that of the dream woman who had come and sat in the sitter's chair and communed with Jimmie as he painted her. And Norma heard her voice. It was an indictment of her life, a judgment and a sentence. "I'm glad you can't, dear," she said to Aline, regaining her balance. "Tell him I shall prize it above all my wedding gifts." They talked quietly for a while about Jimmie's affairs, the pilgrimage through southern France and northern Italy, his illness, his work. His poverty Aline was too proud to mention. "And you, my dear?" asked Norma kindly. "I? What about yourself? You're not looking as happy as you were. My dear child," she said, bending forward earnestly, "do you know that no one has ever come to me with their troubles in all my life? Not once. I'm beginning to feel I should be happier if someone did. You've had yours, I have heard just a little. You see, we all have them, and we might help each other." "You have no troubles, Miss Hardacre," said Aline, touched. "You're going to be married in a week's time." "And you?" "Never," said Aline, "never." Suddenly she poured her disastrous little love story into Norma's ears. It was a wonderful new comfort to the child, this tender magic of the womanly sympathy. Oh, she loved him, of course she loved him, and he loved her. That was the piteous part of it. If Miss Hardacre only knew what it was to have the heartache, it was dreadful, and there was no hope. "And is that all?" asked Norma, when she had lowered the curtain on her tragedy. "You are eating out your heart for him and won't see him just because he won't believe in Jimmie? Listen, I feel sure that he will soon believe in Jimmie. He must. And then you'll be entirely happy." When the girl's grateful arms suddenly flung themselves about her, Norma was further on the road to happiness than she had ever travelled before. She yielded herself to the moment's exquisite charm. Behind her whirled a tumult of longing, shame, struggling faith, nameless suspicion. Before her loomed a shivering dread. The actual moment was an isle of enchanted peace. The clock on a table at the far end of the room, chiming 6, brought her back to the workaday world. She must go home. Morland was coming to dinner, also one or two Cosford people who had already arrived in town in view of the wedding. She would have to dress with some elaborateness. Her heart grew heavy and cold at the prospect of the dreary party. She rose, looked again at the picture in the fading light. Moved by the irresistible, she turned to Aline. "I should like to see him, to thank him, before Wednesday. Do you think he would come?" Aline blushed guiltily. Jimmie's in the house now, she said. Downstairs? Yes. For a moment irresolute, she looked vacantly into the girl's pleading eyes. An odd darkness encompassed her, and she saw nothing. The announcement was a shock of crisis. Dimly she knew that she trod the brink of folly and peril. But she had been caught unawares, and she longed stupidly, achingly, for the sight of his face. The words of Aline, eager in defence of her beloved, seemed far away. "Of course he doesn't know you are here. He was to call for me at 5:45, and I heard the front door open a little while ago. I brought the picture in a cab, and he is under the impression that Mrs. Deering will ask you will do what I have done. Jimmie is perfectly innocent, Miss Hardacre. He has not the remotest idea I was to meet you, not the remotest." Norma recovered herself sufficiently to say with a faint smile, "So this has been a conspiracy between you and Connie Deering?" Aline caught consent in the tone and ignored the question. "Shall I send him up to you?" she asked breathlessly. "Yes," said Norma. There was a girl's glad cry, a girl's impulsive kiss, and Norma was left alone in the room. She had yielded. In a few moments he would be with her, the man who had said, "Her voice haunts me like music heard in sleep. I worship her like a Madonna. I love her as the man of hot blood loves a woman. My soul is a footstool for her to rest her feet upon." And other flaming words of unforgettable passion, the man for whom one instant of her life had been elemental sex, the man whose love had transfigured her on canvas into the wonder among women that she might have been, the man standing in a slough of infamy, whose rising vapours wreathed themselves into a halo about his head. She clenched her hands and set her teeth, wrestling with herself. "My God, what kind of a fool am I becoming?" she breathed. Training, the habit of the mask, came to her aid. Jimmie, entering, saw only the royal lady who had looked kindly upon him in the golden September days. She came to meet him frankly, as one meets an old friend. A new vision revealed to her the heart that leapt into his eyes as they rested upon her. Mistress of herself, she hardened her own, but smiled and spoke softly. "It is great good fortune you have come, so that I can thank you," she said. "But how can I ever thank you for that?" "It is a small gift enough," said Jimmie. "Your acceptance is more than thanks." "I shall prize it dearly. It is like nothing that can be bought. It is something out of yourself you are giving me." "If you look at it in that light," said he, "I am happy indeed." With a common instinct they went up to the portrait and regarded it side by side. Conventional words passed. He inquired after Morland. "You haven't seen him for a long time?" she asked hesitatingly. "Not for a long time." "You must have been very lonely." "I've had Aline and Connie Deering and my work." "Are they sufficient for you?" "Any human love a man gets he can make fill his life. It's like the grain of mustard seed." Norma felt a thrill of admiration. Not a tone in his voice betrayed complaint, reproach, or bitterness. Instead, he sounded the note of thanksgiving for the love bestowed upon him, of faith in the perfect ordering of the world. She glanced at him, and felt that she had wronged him. No matter what was the solution of the mystery, she knew him to be a sweet-souled man, wonderfully steadfast. "Your old way," she replied with a smile, sitting down and motioning him to a chair beside her. "Do you remember that we first met in this very room? You've not changed. Have I?" "No," he said gravely. "You were always beautiful, without and within. I told you that then, if you remember. Perhaps now you are a little truer to yourself." "Do you think so?" she asked, somewhat bitterly. "Perhaps it is the approach of your great happiness," blunted Jimmie in perfect conviction. She was silent. "It has been more to me than I can say," he went on, "to see you once again, as you are, before your marriage. I wish you many blessings, all that love can bring you." "Do you think love is necessary for married happiness?" "Without it, marriage must be a horror," said Jimmie. For a moment she was on the brink of harsh laughter. Did he sincerely believe she was in love with Morland? She could have hurled the question at him. Will checked the rising hysteria and turned it into other channels. Why have you never married? You must have loved somebody once." It was a relief to hurt him. The dusk was gathering in the room, and she could scarcely see his face. A Sunday stillness filled the quiet square outside. The hour had its dangers. "My having loved a woman does not necessarily imply that I could have married her," said Jimmie. The evasion irritated her mood, awoke a longing to make him speak. She drew her chair nearer, bent forward, so that the brim of her great hat almost brushed his forehead, and the fragrance of her overspread him. "Do you remember a picture you wouldn't show me in your studio? You called it a mad painter's dream. You said it was the ideal woman." "You said so," replied Jimmie. "I should like to see it." "It is mine no longer to show you," said Jimmie. "I think you must have loved that woman very deeply." She was tempting him as she had tempted no man before, feeling a cruel, senseless joy in it. His voice vibrated. "Yes, I loved her infinitely." "What was she like?" "Like all the splendid flowers of the earth melted into one rose," said Jimmie. "I wish someone had ever said that about me," she whispered. "Many must have thought it." "She must be a happy woman to be loved by you." "By me? Who am I that I could bring happiness to a woman? I've never told her." "Why not?" she whispered. "Do you suppose you can love a woman without her knowing it?" "In what way can the star be cognizant of the moth's desire?" said Jimmie, going back to the refrain of his love. "You a moth, and she a star? You are a man, and she is but a trumpery bit of female flesh that on a word would throw herself into your arms." "No," said Jimmie hoarsely. "No, you don't know what you are saying." The temptation to goad him was irresistible. "We are all of us alike, all of us. Tell her." "I daren't." "Tell me who she is." She looked at him full, with meaning in her eyes, which glowed like deep moons in the dusk. He brought all his courage into his glance. He was the master. She turned away her head in confusion, reading his love, his strength, his loyalty. A lesser man, loving her, would have thrown honour to the winds. A curious reverence of him filled her. She felt a small thing beside him. All doubts vanished forever. Her faith in him was as crystal clear as Aline's. "I have no right to mention her name," he said after a pause. Norma leaned back in her chair and passed her handkerchief across her lips. "Would you do anything in the world she asked you?" she murmured. "I would go through hell for her," said Jimmie. There was another span of silence, tense and painful. Jimmie broke it by saying, "Why should you concern yourself about my fantastic affairs? They merely belong to dreamland, to the twilight and the stillness. They have no existence in the living world." "If I thought so, should I be sitting in the twilight and the stillness listening to you?" she asked. "Or even if I did, may I not enter into dreamland too, for a few little minutes, before the gates are closed to me forever? Why should you want to shut me out of it? Do you think much love has come my way? Yours are the only lips I have ever heard speak of it." "Morland loves you," said Jimmie tremulously. The door opened. The electric light was switched on, showing two pale, passion-drawn faces, and Connie Deering brought her sweet gaiety into the room. "If I had known you two were sitting in the dark like this, I should have come up earlier. Isn't it nice, Norma, to have Jimmie back again?" The spell was broken. Norma gave an anxious look at the clock, and fled, after hurried farewells. The mistress of the house arched her pretty eyebrows as she returned to Jimmie. "Eh bien?" "Connie," he cleared his throat, "you have kept my secret?" "Loyally," she said. "Have you?" "I have done my best. God knows I have done my best." He sat down, took up a book, and began to turn the leaves idly. Connie knelt down before the fire and put on a fresh log. This done, she came to his side. He took her hand and looked up into her face. "I haven't thanked you, Connie. I do with all my heart." She smiled at him with an odd wistfulness. You once thanked me in a very pretty manner, she said. I think I deserve it again. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 22. Catastrophe. Connie Deering was dining that Sunday evening with some friends at the Carlton, an engagement which had caused her to decline an invitation to the Hardacres. The prospect, however, for once did not appeal to her pleasure-loving soul. She sighed as she stepped into her brougham, and wished as she drove along that she was sitting at home in the tea-gown and tranquillity harmonious with a subdued frame of mind. Problems worried her. What had passed between Norma and Jimmie? Ordinary delicacy had forbidden her questioning, and Jimmie had admitted her no further into his confidence. In that she was disappointed. When a sentimental woman asks for a kiss, she expects something more. She was also half ashamed of herself for asking him to kiss her. A waspish little voice within proclaimed that it was not so much for Jimmie's sake as for her own, that her lifelong fondness for Jimmie had unconsciously slid onto the rails that lead to absurdity. She drew her satin cloak tightly around her, as if to suffocate the imp, and returned to her speculation. Something had happened, of that there was no doubt. Something serious, agitating. It could be read on both their faces. Had she, who alone knew the hearts of each, done right in bringing them together? What had been her object? Even if a marriage between them had not been too ludicrous for contemplation, it would not have been fair towards her cousin Morland to encourage this intrigue. She vowed she had been a little fool to meddle with such gunpowdery matters. And yet she had acted in all innocence for Jimmie's sake. It was right for Norma to be friends with him again. It was monstrous he should suffer. If he could not marry the woman he loved, at least he could have the happiness of knowing himself no longer a blackened wretch in her eyes. But then Norma had taken it into her head to love him too. Had she done right? Her thoughts flew round in a vicious circle of irritatingly small circumference, occasionally flying off on the tangent of the solicited kiss. The first person she met in the vestibule of the Carlton was Theodore Weaver. They exchanged greetings, discovered they belonged to the same party. She had come across him frequently of late in the houses that Norma and herself had as common ground. In a general way she liked him. Since Norma had told her of his view of the scandal, he had risen high in her estimation. But tonight he seemed to be a link in the drama that perplexed her, and she shrank from him as from something uncanny. He sat next to her at table. His first words were of Jimmie. "I was buying pictures yesterday from a friend of yours, Padgate." In her pleasure Connie forgot her nervousness. "Why, he never told me." "He could scarcely have had time unless he telephoned or telegraphed." "He was at my house this afternoon," she explained. He carefully peppered his oysters, then turned his imperturbable face towards her. "So was Miss Hardacre." "How do you know that?" she cried, startled. "I was calling in Devonshire Place. Her mother told me. I'm not necromantic." His swift uniting of the two names perturbed her. She swallowed her oysters unreflectingly, thus missing one of her little pleasures in life, for she adored oysters. "Which picture did you buy?" she asked. "The one I coveted was not for sale. It was a portrait of Miss Hardacre. I don't think he meant me to see it, but I came upon him unawares. Have you seen it?" They discussed the portrait for a while. Connie repeated her formal question. Weaver replied that he had bought the picture of the faun looking at the vision of things to come, and the rejected Italian study. Connie expressed her gladness. They contained Jimmie's best work. "Very fine," Weaver admitted, "but just failing in finish. Nothing like the portrait." There was an interval. Connie exchanged remarks with old Colonel Pawley, her right-hand neighbour, who expatiated on the impossibility of consuming borscht soup with satisfaction outside Russia. The soup removed, Weaver resumed the conversation. "Have you read your Lamartine thoroughly?" "I have. I was sentimental once. He says somewhere, 'Aimer pour être aimé, c'est de l'homme, mais aimer pour aimer, c'est presque de l'ange.' I remember where it comes from. It was said of Checo and Garciella. Our friend Padgate reminds me of Checo." Do you care much about your cousin Morland King, Mrs. Deering?" Connie, entirely disconcerted by his manner, looked at him beseechingly. "Why do you ask me that?" "Because he is one of the dramatis personae in a pretty little comedy on which the curtain is not yet run down." She greatly dared. "Are you too in the cast?" Theodore Weaver deliberately helped himself to fish before replying. Then, with equal deliberation, he stared into her flushed and puzzled face. "I hope so. A leading part, perhaps, if you are the clever and conscientious woman I take you to be." "What part has my cousin Morland played?" she asked. "I must leave you the very simple task of guessing," said Weaver, and he took advantage of her consternation to converse with his left-hand neighbour. "I have painted a peculiarly successful fan, dear Mrs. Deering," said Colonel Pawley in his purring voice. "A wedding present for our dear Miss Hardacre. I've never been so much pleased with anything before. I should like you to see it. When may I come and show it to you?" "The wedding is fixed for 2 o'clock on Wednesday," said Connie, answering like a woman in a dream. The bright room, the crowd of diners, the music, the voice of the old man by her side, all faded from her senses, eclipsed by the ghastly light that dawned upon her. Only one meaning could be attached to Weaver's insinuations. A touch on the arm brought her back to her surroundings with a start. It was Colonel Pawley. "I hope there is nothing," he began in a tone of great concern. "No, nothing, really nothing. Do forgive me," she interrupted in confusion. "You were telling me something. Oh, I'm dreadfully sorry." "It was about the fan," said Colonel Pawley sadly. "A fan?" "Yes, for dear Miss Hardacre, a wedding present." She listened to a repetition of the previous remarks, and to a description of the painting, and this time replied coherently. She would be delighted to see both the fan and himself tomorrow morning. The kind old man launched into a prothalaamian. The happy couple were a splendidly matched pair. Norma the perfect type of aristocratic English beauty, Morland a representative specimen of the British gentleman, the safeguard of the empire, a man, a thorough good fellow, incapable of dishonour, a landed proprietor. He had sketched out a little wedding song which he would like to present with the fan. Might he show that, too, to Mrs. Deering? It was a dreadful dinner. On each side the distressing topic hemmed her in. In vain she tried to make her old friend talk of travel or gastronomy or the comforts of his club. Perverse fate brought him always back to Norma's wedding. She was forced to listen, for to Weaver she dared not address a remark. She longed for escape, for solitude wherein to envisage her dismay. No suspicion of Morland's complicity in the scandal had crossed her mind. Even now it seemed preposterous for a man of honour to have so acted towards his dearest and most loyal friend, to say nothing of the unhappy things that had gone before. Suddenly, towards the end of dinner, she revolted. She turned to Weaver. "I don't believe a word of it." "Of what, dear lady?" "Of what you've told me about Morland and Jimmie Padgate." "I have told you nothing, absolutely nothing," he replied in his expressionless way. "Please remember that. I don't go about libelling my acquaintances." "I shall go and ask Morland straight," she said with spirit. "All success," said Weaver. Dinner over, the little party went into the lounge. The screened light fell pleasantly on palms and pretty dresses, and made the place reposeful after the glare of the dining-room, whose red and white and gold still gleamed through the door above the steps. The red-coated band played a seductive, almost digestive air. A circle of comfortable chairs reserved by the host invited the contented diner to languorous ease and restful gossip. It was the part of a Carlton dinner that Connie usually enjoyed the most. She still took her pleasures wholeheartedly, wherein lay much of her charm. The world, as Jimmie once told her, had not rubbed the dust off her rings. But tonight the sweet after-dinner hour was filled with fears and agitations, and while the party was settling down, she begged release from her host on the score of headache, and made her escape. She would carry out her threats to Weaver. She would see Morland before she slept, and ask him to free her from this intolerable suspicion. She was a loyal, simple woman, for all her inconsequent ways and close experience of the insincerities of life, devoted to her friends, a champion of their causes, loving to believe the best, disturbed beyond due measure at being forced to believe the worst. Jimmie had most of her heart, more of it than she dared confess. But there were places in it both for Norma and for Morland. The latter was her cousin. She had known him all her life. To believe him to have played this sorry part in what it pleased Theodore Weaver to call a pretty comedy was very real pain to the little lady. Her headache was no pretence. No spirit of curiosity or interference drove her to the Hardacres, where she knew she would find Morland. Rather a desire to rid herself of a nightmare. Granted the possibility of baseness on Morland's part, all the dark places in the lamentable business became light. That was the maddening part of Weaver's solution. And would it apply to the puzzle of the afternoon? Had Norma known? Had Jimmie told her? The pair had been agitated enough for anything to have happened. Theodore Weaver, too, had calmly avowed himself an actor in the comedy. What part was he playing? She shivered at the conjecture. He looked like a pale mummy, she thought confusedly, holding in his dull eyes the inscrutable wisdom of the Sphinx. Meanwhile the horses were proceeding at a funereal pace. She pulled the check-string and bade the coachman drive faster. The scene that met her eyes when the servant showed her into the Hardacres' drawing-room was unexpected. Instead of the ordinary after-dinner gathering, only Mr. and Mrs. Hardacre and Morland were in the room. The master of the house, very red, very puffy, sat in an arm-chair before the fire, tugging at his mean little red moustache. Mrs. Hardacre, her face haggard with anxiety, stood apart with Morland, whose heavy features wore an expression of worry, apology, and indignation curiously blended. On a clear space of carpet a couple of yards from the door lay some strings of large pearls. Connie looked from one to the other of the three people who had evidently been interrupted in the midst of an anxious discussion. Here again something had happened. Mrs. Hardacre shook hands with her mechanically. Mr. Hardacre apologized for not rising. "That infernal gout again," he explained, pointing to the slashed slipper of a foot resting on a hassock. Norma had made it worse. He had been infernally upset. "Norma?" Connie turned and looked inquiringly at the other two. "Oh, an awful scene," said Morland gloomily. "Wish to heaven you'd been here. You might have done something." "Perhaps you might bring her to her senses now, though I doubt it. I think she's gone crazy," said Mrs. Hardacre. "But what has occurred?" "She declares she won't marry me, that's all. There's my wedding present on the floor. Tore it from her neck as she made her exit. I don't know what's going to happen." "Where is she now?" "Up in her room, smashing the rest of her wedding presents, I suppose," said Mrs. Hardacre. What? Can't do that. All locked up downstairs in the library," came from the chair by the fire. "Oh dear, don't make idiotic remarks, Benjamin," snapped his wife viciously. The air was electric with irritation. Connie, a peacemaker at heart, forgot her mission in the face of the new development of affairs, and spoke soothingly. Norma could not break off the engagement 3 days before the wedding. Such things were not done. She would come round. It was merely an attack of nerves. They refused to be comforted. "Oh, God knows what it is," said Morland. "I thought things were perfectly square between us. She wasn't cordial before dinner, I'll admit, but she let me put those beads round her neck. I asked her to wear them all the evening, as though there were only the four of us." "The Spencer Temples sent an excuse this afternoon," Mrs. Hardacre explained. "She agreed," Morland continued. "She wore them through dinner. Everything any one of us said seemed to get on her nerves. I talked about the house. She withered me up with sarcasm. We talked about the wedding. She begged us for God's sake to talk of something else. We tried so as to pacify her, but of course it was hardly possible. I said I'd met Lord Monsey yesterday. Told me he and his wife were coming on Wednesday. She asked whether Ashenberg and the rest of Monsey's crew of moneylenders, harlots and fools were coming too. I defended Monsey. He's a friend of mine, and a very decent sort." She shrugged her shoulders. "You know her way." Mrs. Hardacre changed the subject. "After dinner I saw her alone for a bit in the drawing-room. She asked me to take back the pearls, said they were throttling her. Had we better reconsider the whole matter? There was still time. That was the beginning of it. Mr. and Mrs. Hardacre came up. We did all we knew. Used every argument. People invited. Bishop to perform ceremony. Duchess actually coming. Society expected us. The scandal. Her infernally bad treatment of myself. No good. Whatever we said only made her worse. Ended up with a diatribe against society. She was sick of its lies and its rottenness. She was going to have no more of it. She would breathe fresh, pure air." The Lord knows what she didn't say. All of us came in for it, said shocking things about her mother. I didn't love her, had never loved her. A loveless marriage was horrible. Of course I'm in love with her. You all know that. I said so. She wouldn't listen, went on with the harangue. We couldn't stop her. She wouldn't marry me for all the bishops and duchesses in the world. At last I lost my temper and said it was my intention to marry her, and marry me she should. Don't you think I was quite right? She lost hers, I suppose, tore off the pearls, made a sort of peroration, declaring she would sooner die than commit the infamy of marrying me. And that's the end of it. He threw out his hands in desperation and turned away. His account of events from his point of view was accurate. To him, as to Norma's parents, her final revolt appeared the arbitrary act of unreason. They still smarted resentfully under her lashes, incapable of realizing the sins for which they were flagellated. If she had remained at home that afternoon and continued to practice insensibility, she would probably have followed the line of least resistance during the evening. Or, on the other hand, if she could have been alone, a night's fevered sleeplessness would have caused dull reaction in the morning. The cold contempt for things outside her, which had served for strength, was now gone, leaving a helpless woman to be swayed by passion or led spiritless by convention. The heroic in her needed the double spur. Passion shook her. Miserable bondage, claiming her, drove her to rebellion. She rose to sublime heights undreamed of in her earthbound philosophy. She had gone into the street after her interview with Jimmie, white, palpitating, torn. Though the man had spoken tremulous words, it was the unspoken, the wave of longing and all unspeakable things in whose heaving bosom they had been caught, that mattered. The garden of enchantment had thrown wide its gate. She had been admitted within its infinitely reaching vistas, and flowers of the spirit had bared their hearts before her eyes. Dressing, she strove to kill the memory, to deafen her ears to the haunting music, to clear her brain of the intoxication. A thing hardly a woman, hardly a coherent entity, but half marble, half consuming fire, stood before Morland as he clasped the pearl necklace around her throat. The touch of it against her skin caused a shudder. Up to then, sensation had blotted out thought. But now the brain worked with startling lucidity. There was yet time to escape from the thraldom. Idea gathered strength from every word and incident during the meal. The commonness, sordidness, emptiness of the life behind and around and before her were revealed in the unpitying searchlight of an awakened soul. She pleaded with Morland for release. The necklace choked her. She unclasped it. He refused to take it back. She was his. He loved her. Her conduct was an outrage on his affections. She dared him to an expression of passionate feeling. He failed miserably, and her anger grew. Unhappily, he spoke of an outrage upon society. She fastened on the phrase. His affection and society. One was worth the other. Society, the mumbo-jumbo, the grotesque false god to which women were offered up in senseless sacrifice. Her mother instanced the bishop and the duchess as avatars of the divinity. Norma poured scorn on the hierarchy. Mrs. Hardacre implored her daughter by her love for her not to humiliate her thus in the world's eyes. She struck the falsest of notes. Norma turned on her, superb, dramatic, holding the three in speechless dismay. Love? What love had been given her that she should return? She had grown honest. The gods of that house were no longer her gods. They were paltry and dishonoured, shams and hypocrisies. Once she worshipped them. To that she had been trained from her cradle. Her nurses dangled the shams before her eyes. The women who taught her bent fawning knees before the shrines of the false gods. A mother's love? What had she learned from her mother? To simper and harden her heart. That the envy of other simpering hardened women was the ultimate good. That the dazzling end of a young girl's career was to capture some man of rank and fortune. That when she was married, her lofty duty was to wear smarter clothes, give smarter parties, and to inveigle to her house by any base and despicable means smarter people than her friends. What had she learned from her mother? To let men of infamous lives leer at her because they had title or fortune. To pay court to shameless women in the hope of getting to know still more shameless men who might dishonour her with their name. She had never been young, never, never with a young girl's freshness of heart. She spoke venom and was praised for wit. She was the finished product of a vapid world. Her whole existence had been an intricate elaboration of shams, miserable, empty, despicable futilities. How dared her mother stand before her and talk of love? Then a quick, angry scene, a crisp thud of the pearls on the floor, a stormy exit. And that, as Morland said, was the end of it. The three were left staring at each other in angry bewilderment. In the face of this disaster, Connie could not find it in her heart to reproach Morland, still less to hint at Theodore Weaver's insinuation. Rather did she reproach herself for being the cause of the catastrophe, and she was smitten with a sense of guilt when Mrs. Hardacre turned upon her accusingly. "She had tea with you, didn't she? Did you notice anything wrong?" "She didn't seem quite herself, was nervous and strange," said Connie diplomatically. "I think I'd better go up and talk to her," she added, after an anxious pause. "Yes, do, for God's sake, Connie," said Morland. She nodded, smiled the ghost of her bright smile, and, glad of escape, went upstairs. The three sat in gloomy silence, broken only by Mr. Hardacre's maledictions on his gout. It was a bitter hour for them. In a few moments Connie burst into the room with a letter in her hand. She looked scared. "We can't find her. She's not in the house." "Not in the house!" shrieked Mrs. Hardacre. Morland brought his hand down heavily on the piano. "I heard the front door slam half an hour ago." "This is addressed to you, Mrs. Hardacre. It was stuck in her looking-glass." Mrs. Hardacre opened the note with shaky fingers. It ran, "I mean what I say. I'd better leave you all, at least till after Wednesday. My stopping here would be more than you or I could stand." Mr. Hardacre staggered with a gasp of pain to his feet, and his weak eyes glared savagely out of his puffy red face. "Damn it, she must come back. If she doesn't sleep here tonight, I'll cut her off. I won't have anything more to do with her. She's got to come back." "All right, go and tell her then," retorted his wife. "Where do you suppose you're going to find her?" "Oh, she is sure to have gone to my house," said Connie. "But suppose she hasn't," said Morland anxiously. "She was in such a state that anything is possible." "Come with me if you like. The brougham is here." "To Eliza, and bring her home with you, do you hear?" cried Mr. Hardacre. "If you don't, she'll never set foot in my house again. I'm damned if she shall." His wife looked at him queerly for a moment. Then she meekly answered, "Very well, Benjamin." Once only during their long married life had she flattered him when he had spoken to her like that. Then, in ungovernable fury, he had thrown a boot at her head. Mr. Hardacre glared at Morland and Connie, and scrambled, cursing, into his chair. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 23, Norma's Hour. Something had happened. Something mysterious, quickening, a pulsation of the innermost harmonies of life. Its tremendous significance Jimmie dared not conjecture. It was to be interpreted by the wisdom of the simplest, yet that interpretation he put aside. It staggered reason. It was enough for them to have met together in an unimagined intimacy of emotion, to have shared the throb of this spiritual happening. She was to be married in 3 days. He set the fact as a block to further investigation of the mystery. On this side his loyalty suffered no taint. Their relations had but received, in some sense, sanctification. Beyond the barrier lay shame and dishonour. The two were to be married. Therefore they loved. He disciplined a disordered mind with a logic of his own invention. It was a logic that entirely begged the question. Remembered words of Norma. "Do you think much love has come my way? Yours are the only lips I have ever heard speak of it." Fell outside his premises. They clamoured for explanation. So did the rich tremor of her voice. So did the lamentable lack of conviction in his reply. To these things he closed his intelligence. They belonged to the interpretation that staggered reason, that threatened to turn his fundamental conceptions into chaos. And past incidents came before him. During those last days in Wiltshire he had seen that her life lacked completion. That memory too disturbed his discipline. Fanatically he practised it, proving to himself that ice was hot and that the sun shone at midnight. She was happy in her love for Morland. She was happy in Morland's love for her. She had not identified with herself the imaginary woman of his adoration. She had not drunk in the outpouring of his passion. Her breath had not fallen warm upon his cheek. And the quickening of a wonderful birth had no reference to emotions and cravings, quite different, intangible, inexpressible, existent in a far-away spirit-land. He was strangely silent during their homeward journey in the omnibus and the simple evening meal, and Aline, sensitive to his mood, choked down the eager questions that rose to her lips. It was only after supper in the studio, when she lit the spill for Jimmie's pipe, her economical soul deprecating wasted matches, that she ventured to say softly, "I'm afraid you'll miss the picture, Jimmie dear." He waited until the pipe was alight, and breathed out a puff of smoke with a sigh. "Our happiness is made up of the things we miss," he said. "That's a paradox, and I don't believe it," said Aline. "Everything in life is a paradox," he remarked, thinking of his logic. He relapsed into his perplexed silence. Aline settled herself in her usual chair with her work-basket and her eternal sewing. This evening she was recuffing his shirts. Presently she held up a cuff. "See, I'm determined to make you smart and fashionable. I don't care what you say. These are square." "Aren't you putting a round man into a square cuff, my dear?" he asked. She laughed. "Oh, why should you be round? You are smart and rectangular. When you're tied it up, don't you know you are exceedingly good-looking, almost military?" She was delighted to get him back to foolish talk. His preoccupation had disturbed her. Like Connie Deering, she was femininely conscious that something out of the ordinary had passed between Norma and Jimmie. An apprehension as to her dear one's peace of mind had filled her with many imaginings. He returned a smiling answer. She bestirred herself to amuse. Had he remarked the man in the omnibus? His nose cut into 2 compartments. What would he do if he had such a nose? Jimmie felt that he had been selfish and fell into the child's humour. He said that he would blow it. They discussed the subject of noses. He quoted Tristram Shandy. Did she remember him reading to her Slaughterburgius's tale? "The silliest story I ever heard in my life," cried Aline. "It had neither head nor tail." "That is the beauty of it," said Jimmie. "It is all nose." "No, the only story about a nose that is worth anything," Aline declared with conviction of her age and sex, "is Cyrano de Bergerac." She paused as a thought passed swiftly through her mind. "Do you know, if you had a nose like that, you would remind me of Cyrano." "Why, I don't go about blustering and carving my fellow citizens into mincemeat." "No, but you—" she began unreflectingly. Then she stopped short in confusion. Cyrano, Roxana, Christian, Jimmie, Norma, Morland. The parallel was of an embarrassing nicety. She lost her head, reddened, saw that Jimmie had filled the gap. "I don't care," she cried. "You are like him. It's splendid, but it's senseless. You're worth 1,000,000 of the other man, and she knows it as well as I do." She vindictively stitched at the cuff. Jimmie made no reply, but lay back, smoking his pipe. Aline recovered and grew remorseful. She had destroyed with an idiotic word the little atmosphere of gaiety she had succeeded in creating. She pricked her finger several times. At last she rose and knelt by his side. "I'm sorry, Jimmie. Don't be vexed with me." He looked at her, wrinkling his forehead half humorously, half sadly, and patted her cheek. "No, dear," he said, "but I think Slaughterburgius is the better tale. Shall I read it to you again?" "Oh, no, Jimmie," cried the girl, half crying, half laughing. "Please don't, for heaven's sake. I've not been as naughty as that." She resumed her sewing. They talked of daily things. Theodore Weaver's purchases. The fawn. He was sorry to lose it after its companionship for all these years. He would paint a replica, but it would not be the same thing. Other times, other feelings. Gradually the conversation grew spasmodic, dwindled. Jimmie brooded over his mystery, and Aline stitched in silence. The whir of the front doorbell aroused them. Aline put down her work. "It's Renshaw," said Jimmie. Renshaw, a broken-down, out-at-heels, drunken, black-and-white artist, once of amazing talent, was almost the only member of a large Bohemian coterie who continued to regard Jimmie as at home to his friends on Sunday evenings. Jimmie bore with the decayed man and helped him on his way, and was pained when Aline insisted upon opening the windows after his departure. Renshaw had been a subject of contention between them for years. "He's only come to drink whisky and borrow money. Luckily we hadn't any whisky in the house," said Aline. "We can give him beer, my child, and if the man is in need of half a crown, God forbid we should deny it him. Has Hannah come home yet?" "I don't think so. It isn't 10 o'clock. "Then let him in, dear," said Jimmie finally. Aline went upstairs with some unwillingness. She disapproved entirely of Renshaw. She devoutly hoped the man was sober. As she opened the front door, the sharp sound of a turning cab met her ears, and the cloaked tall figure of a woman met her astonished eyes. "Miss Hardacre?" "Yes, dear. Won't you let me in?" The girl drew aside quickly, and Norma passed into the hall. "You?" cried Aline. "I don't understand." "Never mind. Is Jimmie at home?" "Jimmie?" The girl's heart leaped at the name. She stared wide-eyed at Norma, whose features she could scarcely discern by the pinpoint of gas in the hall lamp. "Yes, he's in the studio." "Can I see him? Alone? Do you mind?" In dumb astonishment, Aline took the visitor to the head of the stairs, half lit by the streak of light from the open studio door. Norma paused, bent forward, and kissed her on the cheek. "I know my way," she whispered. Jimmie heard the rustle of skirts that were not Aline's, and, springing to his feet, hurried towards the door. But before he could reach it, Norma entered and stood before him. Her long, dark, silk evening cloak was open at the throat, showing glimpses of white, bare neck. Its high-standing collar set off the stately poise of her head. She wore the diamond star in her hair. To the wondering man who gazed at her, she was a vision of radiant beauty. They held each other's eyes for a second or two, and the first dazzling glory in which she seemed to stand having faded, Jimmie read in her face that desperate things had come to pass. He caught her hand as she came swiftly forward. "Why are you here? My God, why are you here?" "I could stand it no longer," she said breathlessly. "I'm not going to marry Morland. I've cut myself adrift. They all know it. I told them so this evening. The horror of it was unbearable. I have done with it for ever and ever." "The horror of it?" echoed Jimmie. "Don't you think it a horror for two people to marry who have never even pretended to love each other? You said so this afternoon." He released her hands and turned aside. Even the deep, exulting sense of what her presence there must mean could not mitigate a terrible dismay. The interpretation that staggered reason was the true and only one. He had been living in a dream, among shadow shapes which he himself had cast upon the wall. Even now he could not grasp completely the extent of his heroical self-deception. "There has never been any love between you and Morland? It has been a cold-blooded question of a marriage of convenience? I thought so differently." "Since when?" she asked. "Since this afternoon?" "No, not since this afternoon." "If it hadn't been for you, I should have married him. You made it impossible. You taught me things. You made me hate myself and my mean ambitions. That was why I hesitated, put it off till Easter. If I hadn't seen you this afternoon, I should have gone through with it on Wednesday. When I got home, I couldn't face it. He put some pearls, a wedding present, round my neck. They seemed like dead fingers choking out my soul. At last it grew horrible. I'd said things I don't remember now. I couldn't stay in the house. It suffocated me. It would have sent me mad. I think a cab whirled me through the streets. I don't know. I've burnt my ships." She stopped, panting, with her hands on her bosom. His exultation grew, and fear with it. He was like a child trembling before a joy too great to be realized, frightened lest it should vanish. He said, without looking at her, "Why have you come here?" "Where else should I go? Unless—" She halted on the word. "Unless what?" She broke into an impatient cry. "Oh, can't you speak? Do you want me to say everything? There is no need for you to be silent any longer." She faced him. "Who was the woman, the picture woman we spoke of this afternoon?" "You," he said. "You. Who else?" There was a quiver of silence. Then he caught her to him. He spoke foolish words. Their lips met, and passion held them. "Had I anywhere else to go?" she whispered, and he said, "No." She released herself, somewhat pale and shaken. Jimmie, scarcely knowing what he did, took off her cloak and threw it on the long deal table. The sudden fresh chill on arms and neck made her realize that they were bare. It was his doing. She blushed. A delicious sense of shyness crept over her. It soon passed, but evanescent though it was, it remained long in her memory. Jimmie took her in his arms again. He said, "You madden me. I've loved you so long. I'm like a parched soul by a pool of paradise." He took her by the hand, led her to his chair near the stove, and knelt by her side. She looked at him, the edges of her white teeth together, her lips parted. She was living the moment that counts for years in a woman's life. She can only live it once. Great joy or endless shame may come afterwards, but this moment shall ever be to her comfort or her despair. He asked her how she had known. "You told me so." "When?" "At Hedden. Do you think I shall ever forget your words?" She laughed divinely at the puzzledom on his face. "No, you were too loyal to tell me. But you told Connie Deering—" "Hush, don't start. Connie did not betray you. She is the staunchest soul breathing. You and she were on the slope by the croquet lawn. Do you remember? There was a hedge of clipped yew above." "And you overheard?" She laughed again, happily, at his look of distress. "I should be rather pleased now, if I were you," she said, in the softer and deeper tones of her voice. A few moments later he said, "You must give me back the portrait. I shall burn it." "Why?" "You are a million times more beautiful, more adorable." He asked her when she had begun to think of him, the eternal childlike question. She met his lover's gaze steadily. Frankness was her great virtue. "It seems now that I have cared for you since the first day. You soon came into my life, but I didn't know how much you represented. Then I heard you speaking to Connie. That mattered a great deal. When that man shot you, I knew that I loved you. I thought you were dead. I rushed down the slope and propped you up against my knees, and I thought I should go mad with agony." "I never heard of that," said Jimmie in a low voice. He became suddenly thoughtful, rose to his feet, and regarded her with a changed expression, like that of a man awakened from a dream. "What is going to be the end of this?" he asked. Norma, for once unperceptive and replying to a small preoccupation of her own, flushed to her hair. "I know Connie well enough to look her up and ask her for hospitality." "I wasn't thinking of that," said Jimmie. "We've been like children and had our hour of joy, without thinking of anything else. Now we must be grown-up people. After what has passed between us, I could only ask you to be my wife." "I came here for you to ask me," she said. "I have no right to do so, dear. I bear a dishonoured name. The wonder and wild desire of you made me forget." She looked at him strangely, her lips working in the shadow of her old smile of mockery. "That proves to me that it is your name, and not yourself, that is dishonoured. If it had been yourself, you would not have forgotten." Jimmie drew himself up, and there was a touch of haughtiness in his manner that Norma in her woman's way noted swiftly. In spite of his homeliness, there was the undefinable spirit of the great gentleman in Jimmie. "I am dishonoured. The matter was public property. Discuss it with no one, least of all with you." "Very well," she said. "Let it never be mentioned again between us. I arrange myself with a lien. I shall believe what I like. You can't prevent my doing that, can you? I choose to believe you are the one thing God made in which I can find happiness. That's enough for me, and it ought to be enough for you." Jimmie put his hand on her shoulder, deeply moved. "My dearest, you mustn't say things like that." He repeated the words. "You mustn't say things like that." Then he was conscious of the warm softness on which his hand rested. She raised her arm and touched his fingers. It was a moment of deep temptation. He resisted, drew his hand away gently.
"There is another reason why it cannot be," he said. "You belong to a world of wealth and luxury. I have been in poverty all my life. God forbid I should complain, I have never done so. But it is a life of struggle for daily bread. Aline and I are used to it. We laugh. We often dine with Duke Humphrey. We make believe like the Marchioness. What the discipline of life and a sort of gypsy faith in Providence has made us regard as a jest would be to you a sordid shift, an intolerable ugliness stripping life of its beauty."
"Oh, hush," she pleaded.
"No, I must talk, and you must listen," he said with a certain masterful dignity. "Look at you now, in the exquisite loveliness of your dress, with that diamond star in your hair, with that queenly presence of yours. Do you fit in with all this? Your place is in great houses, among historic pictures, rare carpets, furniture that is invested with the charm of an artist's touch. The chair you are sitting in, the lever is split and the springs are broken."
He was walking now backwards and forwards across the studio, fulfilling his task bravely, scarcely trusting himself to look at her.
"Your place," he continued, "is among the great ones of the earth, princes, ambassadors, men of genius. Here are but the little folk, even should they come, as they used to do, homely men with rough ways and their wives, sweet simple women with a baby and a frock a year, God help them. I can't ask you to share this life with me, my dear. I should be a scoundrel if I did. As it is, I have fallen below myself in letting you know that I love you. You must forgive me. A man is, after all, a man, whether he be beggar or prince. You must go back into your world and forget it all. The passion flower cannot thrive in the hedge with the dog rose, my dearest. It will pine and fade. We must end it all, don't you see? You don't know what poverty means, even decent poverty like ours. Look, the men you know have valets to dress them. When you came, Aline was sewing new cuffs on my shirts. I don't suppose you ever knew that such things were done. Mere existence is a matter of ever-anxious detail. I'm a careless fellow, I'm a selfish brute, like most men, and give over to the women folk around me the thousand harassing consideration of ways and means for every day and every year. But I see more than they think. Aline can tell you. I daren't, my dear, ask you to share this life with me. I daren't. He came to a stop in front of her, saw her leaning over the arm of the chair away from him, her face covered by her hands. Her white shoulders twitched in little convulsive movements. "Why, my dear, he said in a bewilderment of distress, and kneeling by her he took her wrists and drew them to him. The palms of her hands and her cheeks were wet with miserable tears. "What must you think of me? What futile, feeble creature must you think me? Heaven knows I'm degraded enough, but not to that level. Do you suppose I ever thought you a rich man? Oh, you have hurt me, flayed me alive. I didn't deserve it. I would follow you in rags barefoot through the world. What does it matter so long as it is you that I follow?" What could mortal man do but take the wounded woman of his idolatry into his arms? The single-hearted creature, aghast at the havoc he had wrought, bitterly reproached himself for want of faith in the perfect being. He had committed a horrible crime, plunged daggers, stab after stab, into the radiant bosom. She sobbed in his embrace, a little longer than was strictly necessary. Tears and sobs were a wonder to her, who since early childhood had never known the woman's relief of weeping. It came upon her first as a wondrous, new-found emotion, when his strong arms were about her, as an unutterably sweet solace. And the man's voice in her ears was all that has nearly been said, but never been quite said, in music. Presently she drew herself away from him. "Do you think I am such a fool that I can't sew?" He sank back on his heels. She rose, helping herself to rise by a hand on his arm, an action wonderfully sweet in its intimacy, and crossed over to Aline's cane-bottomed, armless, easy chair. She plucked the shirt from the basket on the top of which Aline had thrust it, groped among the wilderness of spools, tape, bits of ribbon, scissors, needle-cases, patterns,
and year-old draper's bills for a thimble, found the needle sticking in the work, and began to sew with a little air of defiance. Jimmie looked on, ravished. He drew nearer. "God bless my soul," he said. "Do you mean to say you can do that?" There was nothing she could not do in this hour of exaltation. She had found herself, simple woman with simple man. It was her hour. Her feet trod the roots of life. Her head touched the stars. "Sit in your chair and smoke, and let us see what it will be like," she commanded. He obeyed, but whether it was tobacco or gunpowder in his old briarwood pipe he could not have told. The poor wretch was mazed with happiness. "Poor little Aline is all by herself upstairs," said Norma after a while.
"Heaven forgive me," cried Jimmie, starting up. "I hadn't thought about her."
End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 24. Mrs. Hardacre Forgets. While this tragical comedy of the domestic felicities was being enacted, Connie Deering's brougham containing 3 agitated, silent human beings was rapidly approaching the scene. They had made certain of finding Norma at Bryanston Square. The news that she had not arrived disquieted them. Morland anxiously suggested the police. They had a hurried colloquy, Morland and Connie standing on the pavement, Mrs. Hardacre inside the carriage, thrusting her head through the window. Connie falteringly confessed to the meeting of Jimmie and Norma in the afternoon. Something serious had evidently passed between them. Morland broke into an oath.
"By God, that's where she's gone. Damn him!"
"We must get her away at all costs," said Mrs. Hardacre tensely. "I am afraid it is my fault," said Connie. "Of course it is," Mrs. Hardacre replied brutally. "The best you can do is to help us to rescue her." They started. The brougham was small, the air heavy, their quest distasteful, its result doubtful. The sense of fretfulness became acute. Mrs. Hardacre gave vent to her maternal feelings. When she touched on the vile seducer of her daughter's affections, Connie turned upon her almost shrewishly. "This is my carriage. I am not going to hear my dearest friend abused in it." Morland sat silent and worried. When they stopped at the house, he said, "Think I shall stay outside." Connie, angry with him for having damned Jimmie, bent forward. "Are you afraid of facing Jimmie?" she said, with a little note of contempt.
"Certainly not," he replied viciously.
A few moments later, Aline ran into the studio with a scared face. "Jimmie!" He went up to her, and she whispered into his ear. Then he turned to Norma.
"Your mother and Connie and Morland are upstairs. I don't suppose you are anxious to see them. May I tell them what has happened?"
Norma rose and joined him in the centre of the studio. "I would sooner tell them myself. Can they come down here?"
"If you wish it."
He gave the order to Aline. Before going, she took him by the arm, and swiftly glancing at Norma, asked eagerly, "What has happened?"
"The wonder of wonders, dear," said Jimmie.
With a glad cry, she ran upstairs and brought down the visitors who were waiting in the hall. Jimmie stood by the open door to receive them. Norma retired to the far end of the studio. She held her head high and felt astonishingly cool and self-possessed. Mrs. Hardacre entered first, and without condescending to look at Jimmie, marched straight up to her daughter. Then came Connie and Aline, the girl excited, her arm round her friend's waist. Morland, on entering, drew Jimmie aside.
"So you've bested me," he said in an angry whisper. "You held the cards, I know. I didn't think you would use them. I wish you joy."
A sudden flash of pain and indignation lit Jimmie's eyes.
"Good God, man! Have you sunk so low as to accuse me of that? Me?"
He turned away. Morland caught him by the sleeve.
"I say,"
he began. So Jimmie shook him off and went to the side of Norma, who was listening to her mother's opening attack. It was shrill and bitter. When she paused, Norma said stonily, "I'm not going home with you tonight, Mother. I sleep at Connie's. She will not refuse me a bed." "Your father means what he says." "So do I, Mother. I can manage pretty well without your protection till I am married. Then I shan't need it."
Pray whom are you going to marry? Asked Mrs. Hardacre acidly. I should think it was obvious, said Norma. Mr. Padgate has done me the very great honour to ask me to be his wife. I have agreed. I am over age and a free agent, so there's nothing more to be said, mother. Mrs. Hardacre refused to take the announcement seriously. Her thin lips worked into a smile. This is sheer folly, my dear Norma. Over age or not, we can't allow you to disgrace yourself and us. We have never had such honour conferred on us in all our lives, said Norma. Mrs. Hardacre shrugged her shoulders pityingly. Among sane folks it would be a disgrace and a scandal. Even Mr. Padgate would scarcely take advantage of a fit of hysterical folly. She turned to Jimmie. I assure you she is hardly responsible for her actions. You are aware what you would be guilty of in bringing her into this... She paused for a word and waved her hand around. Hovel? Suggested Jimmie grimly. Yes, I'm aware of it. Miss Hardacre must not consider herself bound by anything she has said tonight. Connie Deering, who had come up waiting for a chance to speak, her forget-me-not eyes curiously hard and dangerous, broke in quickly. Why did you say even Mr. Padgate, Mrs. Hardacre? Mr. Padgate has a reputation, said Mrs. Hardacre with an expressive gesture. Jimmie, he checked his advocate. Please, no more. I should think not, indeed. Are you coming, Norma? You'd better go, said Jimmie softly. Why quarrel with your parents? Tomorrow, a week, a month hence, you can tell me your wishes. I set you quite free. Norma made a movement of impatience. Don't make me say things I should regret. I'm not going to change my mind. No, mother, I am not coming. Morland had not said a word, but stood in the background, hating himself. Only Connie's taunt had caused him to enter this maddeningly false position. He knew that his accusation, though he believed it true at the time, was false and base. Jimmie was true gold. He had not betrayed him. Connie, when Jimmie had checked her, went across to Morland. Do you believe that Jimmie deserves his reputation? She said, for his ears alone. I don't know, he answered moodily, kicking at a hassock. I do know, she said, and it's damnable. A quick glance exchanged completed her assurance. He saw that she knew and despised him. For a few moments he lost consciousness of externals in alarmed contemplation of this new thing, a self openly despised by one of his equals. Mrs. Hardacre's voice aroused him. She was saying her final words to Norma. I leave you. When you are in the gutter with this person, don't come to ask me for help. You can encognize yourself as much as you like, for all I care. This adventurer... Jimmie interposed in her grand manner. Pray remember, Mrs. Hardacre, that for the moment you are my guest. Your guest? For the second time that evening she had been rebuked. Her eyes glittered with spite and fury. She lost control. Your guest? If I went to rescue my daughter from a house of ill fame, should I regard myself as a guest of the keeper? How dare you? How do I know what doesn't go on in this house? That girl over there. Norma sprang forward and gripped her by the arm. Mother! She shook herself free. How do I know? How do you know? The man's name stinks over England. No decent woman has anything to do with him. Have you forgotten last autumn, that beastly affair? If you choose to succeed the other woman... Oh, damn it! Burst out Morland suddenly. This is more than I can understand. Have you forgotten what I told you a week ago? The venomous woman was brought to a full stop. She stared helplessly at Morland, drawing quick, panting breaths. She had forgotten that he was in the room. The cynicism was too gross even for him. There are limits to every man's baseness and cowardice. Moreover, his secret was known. To proclaim it himself was a more heroic escape than to let it be revealed with killing contempt by another. The two forces converged suddenly and found their resultant in his outburst. It was characteristic of him that there should be two motives, though which one was the stronger it were hard to say. Most likely revolt at the cynicism, for he was not a depraved man. Norma looked swiftly from one to the other. What did you tell my mother a week ago? Jimmie picked up Morland's crush hat that lay on the table and thrust it into his hand. Oh, that's enough, my dear good fellow. Don't talk about those horrible things. Mrs. Hardacre would like to be going. You'd better see her home. Good night."
He pushed him as he spoke gently towards Mrs. Hardacre, who was already moving towards the door. But Norma came up. "I insist upon knowing," she said.
"No, no," said Jimmie in an agitated voice. "Let the dead past bury its dead. Don't rake up old horrors."
Morland cleared himself away from Jimmie.
"My God, you are a good man. I've been an infernal blackguard. Everybody had better know. If Jimmie hadn't taken it upon himself, that madman would have shot me. He would have hit the right man. I wish to heaven he had."
Norma grew white. "And this is what you told my mother?"
"I thought I ought to," said Morland, looking away from the anxious faces around him. "You shouldn't have done it," said Jimmie in a low voice. He was bent like a guilty person. Norma went to the door and opened it. "Kindly see my mother into a cab." "Please take the brougham," said Connie. "Norma and I will take a cab later." Morland made a movement as if to speak to Jimmie. Norma intercepted him, waved her hand towards her mother, who stood motionless. "Go, please go," she said in a constrained voice. "Take the brougham. She will catch cold while you are whistling for a cab, and you will be the sooner gone." Mrs. Hardacre, stunned by the utter disaster that she had brought about, mechanically obeyed Morland's gesture and passed through the open door without looking at her daughter. As Morland passed her, he plucked up a little courage. "We both lied for your sake," he said,
which might have been an apology or a tribute. Norma gave no sign that she had heard him. Jimmie followed them upstairs and opened the front door. He put out his hand to Morland, who took it and said, "Good night," in a shamefaced way. Mrs. Hardacre stepped into the brougham like a somnambulist. Morland did not accompany her. He had seen enough of Mrs. Hardacre for the rest of his life. When Jimmie went down to the studio, he saw Norma and Connie bending over a chair in the far corner. Aline had fainted. They administered what restoratives were to hand, water and Connie's smelling salts, and took the girl up to her bedroom, where she was left in charge of Mrs. Deering. Jimmie and Norma returned to the studio. The preoccupation of tending Aline, whose joy in the utter vindication of her splendid faith had been too sudden a strain upon an overwrought nervous system, had been welcomed almost as a relief to the emotional tenseness. They had not spoken of the things that were uppermost. They sat down in their former places without exchanging a remark. Jimmie took up his pipe from the table by his side and knocked the ashes into the ashtray and blew through it to clear it. Then he began to fill it from his old tobacco pouch, clumsy as all covered pouches are, and rough with faded clumps of moss roses and forget-me-nots worked by Aline years before.
"Why don't you go on with the sewing?" he said.
She waited a second or two before answering, and when she spoke did not trust herself to look at him. "I ought to say something, I know," she said in a low voice. "But there are things one can't talk of, only feel."
"We never need talk of them," said Jimmie. "They are over and done with. Old, forgotten, far-off things now."
"Are they? You don't understand. They will always remain. They make up your life. You are too big for such as me altogether. By rights, I should be on my knees before you. Thank God I didn't wait until I learned all this, but came to you in faith. I feel poor enough to hug that to myself as a virtue."
"I am very glad you believed in me," said Jimmie,
laying down the unlit pipe which he had been fondling.
"I wouldn't be human if I didn't. But you mustn't exaggerate. Exposure would have ruined Morland's career, and I thought it would go near breaking your heart. To me, an insignificant devil, what did it matter?"
"Didn't my love for you matter? Didn't all that you have suffered matter? Oh, don't minimize what you have done. I am afraid of you. Your thoughts are not my thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. You will always be among the stars, while I am crawling about the earth." Jimmie rose hurriedly and fell at her feet and took both her hands and placed them against his cheeks.
"My dear," he said, moved to his depths. "My dear, my wonderful, worshipped, God-sent dear. You are wrong, utterly wrong. I'm only a poor fool of a man, as you will soon find out, whose one merit is to love you. I would sell my body and my soul for you. If I made a little sacrifice for the love of you, what have you done tonight for me, the sacrifice of all the splendour and grace of life?" "The lies and the rottenness," said Norma with a shiver. "Did you comprehend my mother?" He took her hands from his face and kissed her fingers. "Dear, those are the unhappy, far-off things. Let us forget them. They never happened. Only one thing in the world has ever happened. You have come to me, Norma," he said softly, speaking her name for the first tremulous time. "Norma." Their eyes met, and then their lips. The world stood still for a space. She sighed and looked at him. "You will have to teach me many things," she said. "You will have to begin at the very beginning." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 25. The Land of Enchantment. Everyone knew that the marriage arranged between Morland King and Norma Hardacre would not take place. It was announced in the Times and Morning Post on the Tuesday morning. Those bidden to the wedding received hurried messages, and a day or two later the wedding gifts were returned to the senders, who stored them up for some happier pair. But the new engagement upon which Norma had entered remained a secret. Norma herself did not desire to complete the banquet of gossip she had afforded society, and Mrs. Hardacre was not anxious to fill to overflowing the cup of her own humiliation. The stricken lady maintained a discreet reserve. The lovers had quarrelled. Norma had broken off the match and would not be going out for some time. She even defied the Duchess, who commanded an explicit statement of reasons. Her Grace retorted severely that she ought to have brought her daughter up better, and signified that this was the second time Norma had behaved with scandalous want of consideration for her august convenience. "She shall not have the opportunity of doing it again. I dislike being mixed up in scandals," said the Duchess. And Mrs. Hardacre saw the gates of Wiltshire House and Chiltern Towers closed to her for ever. But of the impossible painter wretch she spoke not a word, hoping desperately that in some mysterious fashion the God of her fathers would avert this crowning disgrace from them, and would lead Norma forth again into the paths of decency and virtue. As for her husband, he stormily refused to speak or hear the outcast's name. He had done with her. She should never sleep again beneath the roof she had dishonoured. He would not allow her a penny. He would cut her out of his will. She had dragged him in the mud, and by heaven she could go to the devil. It took much to rouse the passions of the feeble, mean-faced little man, but once they were roused, he had the smiling tenacity of the fox. Mrs. Hardacre did not tell him of Morland's confession and the rehabilitation of his rival. The memory of her stunning humiliation brought on a feeling akin to physical nausea. She strove to bury it deep down in her subconsciousness, beneath all the other unhallowed memories. There were none quite so rank. On the other hand, her husband's vilification of the detested creature was a source of consolation which she had no desire to choke. Why should she deny herself this comfort? The supreme joy of vitriol throwing was not countenanced in her social sphere. At odd times she regretted that she was a lady. While the black fog of depression darkened Devonshire Place, in neighbouring parts of London the days were radiant. 1,000 suns glorified the heavens, and the breaths of 1,000 springs perfumed the air. It was a period of exaggeration, unreality, a page out of a fairy tale lived and relived. Norma abandoned herself to the intoxication, heedless of the fog in Devonshire Place and the decent grey of the world elsewhere. She refused to think or speculate. Rose veils shrouded the future. The present was a fantasy of delight. For material things, food, shelter, raiment, she had no concern. Connie fed and housed her, making her the thrice welcome guest, the beloved sister. From society she withdrew altogether.
Visitors paid calls, odd people were entertained at meals, the routine of a wealthy woman's establishment proceeded in its ordinary course, and Norma's presence in the house remained unknown and unsuspected. She was there in hiding. The world was given to understand that she was in Cornwall. Even common life has thus its air of romance and mystery. Being as it were a fugitive, she had no engagement. There was a glorious incongruity in the position. She regarded the beginnings of the London season with the amused detachment of a disembodied spirit revisiting the scenes of which it once made a part. Morning, afternoon, and evening she was free, an exhilarating novelty. Nobody wanted to see her, save Jimmie. Save him, she wanted to see nobody. They met every day, sometimes in the sitting-room on the ground floor which Connie had set apart for her guests' exclusive use, and sometimes in Jimmie's studio. Now and then, when the weather was fine, they walked together in sweet places unfrequented by the fashionable world, Regent's Park and Hampstead Heath, fresh woods and pastures new to Norma, who had heard of the Heath vaguely as an undesirable common where the lower orders wore each other's hats and shied at coconuts. Its smiling loneliness and April beauty, seen perhaps through the artist's eyes, enchanted her. Jimmie pointed out its undulations, like a bosom, said he, swelling with the first breaths of pure air on its release from London. Most of all, she loved to drive up to St. John's Wood after dinner and burst upon him unexpectedly. The new bohemian freedom of it all was a part of the queer, delicious life. She laughed in anticipation at his cry of delighted welcome. When she heard it, her eyes grew soft. To lift her veil and hang back her head to receive his kiss on her lips was an ever-new sensation. The intimacy had a bewildering sweetness. To complete it, she threw aside gloves and jacket and unpinned her hat, a battered gilt empire mirror over the long table serving her to guide the necessary touches to her hair. Although she did not repeat the little comedy of the shirt which had been inspired by the exaltation of a rare moment, yet she sat in Aline's chair, now called her own, and knitted at a silk tie she was making for him. She had learned the art from her aunt in Cornwall, and she brought the materials in a little black silk bag slung to her wrist. The housewifely avocation fitted in with the fairy tale. Jimmie smoked and talked, the most responsive and least tiring of companions. His elusive speech, that of the imaginative and cultured man, in itself brought her into a world different from the one she had left. His simplicity, his ignorance of the ways of women, his delight at the little discoveries she allowed him to make, gave it a touch of Arcadia. In passionate moments there was the unfamiliar, poetic, rhapsodic in his utterance, which turned the world into a corner of heaven. And so the magic hours passed. "I do believe I have found a soul," she remarked on one of these evenings, "and that's why I must be so immoderately happy. I'm like a child with a new toy." She was unconscious of the instinctive, pitiless analysis of herself, and Jimmie, drunk with the wonder of her, did not heed the warning. Of their future life together they only spoke as happy lovers in the rosy mist shed about them by the veil. They dwelt in the glamour of the fairy tale, where the princess who marries the shepherd lives not only happy ever afterwards, but also delicately dressed and daintily environed, her chief occupation being to tie silk bows round the lambs' necks, and to serve to her husband the whitest of bread and the whitest of cheese with the whitest of hands. Their forecast of the future might have been an idyll of Theocritus. "You will be the inspiration of all my pictures, dear," said Jimmie. "I will sit for you as a model, if I am good enough." "Good enough." Language crumbled into meaningless vocables before her infinite perfection. "I have had a little talent. You will give me genius." "I will also give you your dinner." She laughed adorably. "Do you know, Connie told me I must learn to cook. I had my first lesson this morning in her kitchen. A most poetic way of doing sweetbreads. Do you like sweetbreads?" "Now I come to think of it, I do, enormously. I wonder why Aline never has them." "We'll have some. Our first lunch at home." "And you will cook them?" cried the enraptured man. She nodded. "In a most becoming white apron. You'll see."
"You'll be like a goddess taking her turn preparing the dearly ambrosia for Olympus," said Jimmie.
On another occasion they spoke of summer holidays. They would take a little cottage in the country. It would have honeysuckle over the porch, and beds of mignonette under the windows, and an old-fashioned garden full of stocks and hollyhocks and sunflowers. There would be doves and bees. They would go out early and come home with the dew on their feet. They would drink warm milk from the cow. They would go a-haymaking. Norma's idea of the pastoral pathetically resembled that of the Petit Trianon. The magic of the present, with its passionate worship on the part of the man, and its satisfaction of the soul's hunger on the part of the woman, was in itself enough to blind their eyes to the possible prose of the future. Another interest, one of the sweetest of outside interests that combined two lovers together, helped to fix their serious thoughts to the immediate hour. Side by side with their romance grew up another, vitally interwoven with it for a spell, and now springing clear into independent life. The two children, Aline and Tony Merriweather, had found each other again, and the fresh beauty of their young loves lit the deeper passion of the older pair with the light of spring sunrise. In precious little moments of confidence, Aline opened to Norma her heart's dewy happiness, and what Norma in delicate honour could divulge she told to Jimmie, who in his turn had his little tale to bear. More and more was existence like the last page of a fairy book. The reconciliation of the younger folk had been a very simple matter. It was the doing of Connie Deering. The morning after Morland's confession she summoned Tony Merriweather to an interview. He arrived wondering. She asked him point blank, "Are you still in love with Aline Marden, or have you forgotten all about her?" The young fellow declared his undying affection. "Are you aware that you have treated her shamefully?" she said severely. "I am the most miserable dog unhung," exclaimed the youth. He suddenly looked miserable, thin, and worried. He gave his view of the position. Connie's heart went out to him. "Suppose I told you that everything was cleared up and you could go to Aline with a light conscience." "I should go crazy with happiness," he cried, springing to his feet. "Aline deserves a sane husband. She's 1 in 1,000. She's 1 in 20,000 million. There she goes, hand in hand with Jimmie Padgate. It's to tell you that I've asked you to come. I hope you'll let them both know you're aware of it." Satisfied that he was worthy of her confidence, she told him briefly what had occurred. "And now what are you going to do?" she asked, smiling. "Do? I'll go on my knees. I'll grovel at his feet. I'll ask him to make me a doormat. I'll do any mortal thing Aline tells me." "Well, go now and do your penance and be happy," Connie said, holding out her hand. "I don't know how I can thank you, Mrs. Deering," he cried. "You're the most gracious woman that ever lived." A few moments later, an impassioned youth was speeding in a hansom cab to Friary Grove. But Connie, with the memory of his clear-cut, radiant young face haunting her, sighed. Chance decreed that the very moment should bring her a letter from Jimmie, written that morning, full of his wonder and gratitude. She sighed again, pathetically, foolishly, unreasonably, feeling left out in the cold. "I wonder whether it would do me good to cry," she said, half aloud. But the footman entering with the announcement that the carriage which was to take her to her dressmaker was at the door settled the question. She had to content herself with sighs. Tony Merriweather did not go on his knees, as Aline had ordained, but he made his apology in so frank and manly a way that Jimmie forgave him at once. Besides, said he, what had he to forgive? "I feel like Didymus," said Tony. Jimmie laughed as he clapped him on the shoulder and pushed him out of the studio. "You better cultivate the feeling. He became a saint eventually. Aline will help to make you one." If plain indication of another's infirmities contend to qualify him for canonization, Aline certainly justified Jimmie's statement. She did not confer her pardon so readily on the doubting disciple. His offence had been too rank. It was not merely a question of his saying a credo and then taking her into his arms. She exacted much penance before she permitted this blissful consummation. He had to woo and protest and humble himself exceedingly. But when she had reduced him to a proper state of penitence, she gave him plenary absolution and yielded to his kiss, as she had been yearning to do since the beginning of the interview. After that she settled down to her infinite delight. Nothing was lacking in the new rapturous scheme of existence. The glory of Jimmie was vindicated, Tony had come back to her, the bars to their marriage had vanished. Not only was Tony a man of substance, with a legacy of £8,000 that had been left him, and therefore able to support as many wives as the Grand Turk, but Jimmie no longer had to be provided for. The wonder of wonders had happened. She could surrender her precious charge with a free conscience and a heart bursting with gratitude. Thus the happiness of each pair of lovers caught a reflection from that of the other, and its colour was rendered ever so little fictitious, unreal. The light of spring sunrise, exquisite though it is, invests things with a glamour which the light of noon dispels. The spectacle of the young romance unfolding itself before the eyes of Jimmie and Norma completed their delicious sense of the idyllic. But the elusive atmosphere thus created caused them to view their own romance in slightly false perspective. Essentially, it was a drama of conflict, themselves against the pettinesses and uglinesses of the world. Apparently it was a pastoral among spring flowers. Another cause that contributed to Norma's unconcern for the future was her exaggerated sense of the man's loftiness of soul. Instead of viewing him as a lovable creature capable of the chivalrous and the heroic, and afforded by a happy fate an opportunity of displaying these qualities, for the opportunity makes the hero as much as it does the thief, she grovelled whole-sexedly before an impossible idol imbued with impossible divinity. While knitting silk ties and devising with him the preparation of foodstuffs, which she did not realize he would not be able to afford, she was conscious of a grace in the trifling, all the more precious because of these little earthly things midway between the empyrean and the abyss which they respectively inhabited. In the deeply human love of each was a touch of the fantastic. To Jimmie she was the princess of Wonderland, the rare lady of dreams. To Norma he appeared little less than a god. She was talking one evening with Connie Deering in a somewhat exalted strain of her own unworthiness and Jimmie's condescension, when the little lady broke into an unwonted expression of impatience. "My dear child, every foolish woman is a valet to her hero. You would like to clean his boots, wouldn't you?" "My dear Connie," cried Norma, alarmed, "whatever is the matter?" "I think you two had better get married as quickly as possible. It is getting on one's nerves." Norma stiffened. "I am sorry," she began. Connie interrupted her. "Don't be silly. There's nothing for you to be sorry about." She brightened and laughed, realizing the construction Norma had put upon her words. "I'm only advising you for your good. I had half an hour's solitary imprisonment with Theodore Weaver this afternoon. He always takes it out of me. It's like having a bath with an electric eel. He called this afternoon to get news of you." "Of me?" asked Norma serenely, setting herself in the depths of her chair. "He is like an eel," Connie exclaimed with a shiver. "He's the coldest bloody thing I've ever come across. I told you about the dinner at the Carlton, didn't I? Here's that he reckoned on my doing just what I rushed off to do. It makes me so angry," she cried with feminine emphasis on the last word. "Of course, he didn't tell me so brutally. He has a horrid snake-like method of insinuation. He had counted on my getting at the truth, which he guessed, and so stopping the marriage. 'I'm a true prophet,' he said. 'I knew that marriage would never come off.'" "So he told me," said Norma. "Do you know there must be some goodness in him to have perceived the goodness in Jimmie?" "I believe he's a disembodied spirit without either goodness or badness, a sort of non-moral monster." Connie was given to hyperbole in her likes and dislikes. She continued her tale. He had come to ask her advice. Now that Miss Hardacre was free, did Mrs. Deering think he might press his suit with advantage? His stay in Europe was drawing to a close. He would like to take back with him to New York either Miss Hardacre or a definite refusal. "You certainly cannot take back Miss Hardacre," I said, "because she is going to marry Jimmie Padgate." I thought this would annihilate him. But do you think he moved a muscle? Not he. What did he say? Asked Norma, lazily amused. This is getting somewhat monotonous, replied Connie. Norma laughed. Nothing else? He began to talk about theatres. He has the most disconcerting way of changing the conversation. But on leaving he said his congratulations to you, and said that you were always to remember that you were the wife specially designed for him by Providence. You dear thing, said Norma, and did that get on your nerves? Wouldn't it get on yours? Norma shook her head. I haven't any nerves for things to get on. People don't have nerves when they're happy. And are you happy? Really, really happy? I am deliciously happy, said Norma. She went to bed laughing at the discomfiture of Weaver and the remoteness of him, and of the days last summer when she first met him among the Monse's disreputable crowd. He belonged to a former state of existence. Jimmie's portrait, which had been put for 2 or 3 reasons in her bedroom, caught her attention. She looked at it with a dreamy smile for a long time, and then turned to the glass. Made curiously happy by what she saw there, she kissed her fingers to the portrait. He is the better prophet, she said. But Connie's advice as to the desirability of a speedy marriage remained in her mind. Jimmie, with characteristic diffidence, had not yet suggested definite arrangements. She was gifted with so much insight as to apprehend the reasons for his lack of initiative. His very worship of her, his overwhelming sense of goddess conferred boon in her every smile and condescension, precluded the asking of favours. So far it was she who had arranged their daily life. It was she who had established the custom of the studio visits, and she had taken off her hat and had inaugurated the comedy of the domestic felicities of her own accord. She treasured this worship in her heart as a priceless thing, all the more exquisite because it lay by the side of the knowledge of her own unworthiness. The sacrifice of maidenly modesty in proposing instead of coyly yielding was at once a delicious penance for hypocritical assumption of superiority, and a salve to her pride as a beautiful and desirable woman. It was with a glorious sureness of relation, therefore, that she asked him the next day if he had thought of a date for their marriage. There is no reason for a long engagement that I can see, she added, with a blush which she felt and was tremulously happy at feeling. I was waiting for you to say, dear, he replied, his arm around her. I dared not ask. She laughed the deep laugh of a woman's happiness. I knew you would say that, she murmured. Let it be some time next month. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 26. Earth Again. One day Norma received a polite intimation from her bankers that her account was overdrawn. This had happened before, but on previous occasions she had obtained from her father an advance on her allowance, and the unpleasant void at the bank had been filled. Now she realized with dismay that the allowance had been cut off, and that no money could come into her possession until the payment of the half-yearly dividend from the concern in which her small private fortune was invested. She looked in her purse and found 5 shillings. On this she would have to live for 3 weeks. Her money was in the hands of trustees, wisely tied up by the worldly aunt from whom she had inherited it, so that she could not touch the capital. While she was contemplating the absurdity of the position, the maid brought up a parcel from a draper's on which there was 3 11 halfpenny to pay. She surrendered 4 of her shillings, and disconsolately regarded the miserable one that remained. The position had grown even more preposterous. She actually needed money. She had not even the amount of a cab fare to Friary Grove. She would not have it for 3 weeks. Preposterous or not, the fact was plain and demanded serious consideration. She would have to borrow. The repayment of the loan and the overdraft would reduce the half-yearly dividend. A goodly part of the remainder would be required to meet an outstanding milliner's bill, not included in the bridal trousseau for which her father was to pay. The sum, in simple arithmetic, frightened her. I am poverty-stricken, she said to Connie, to whom she confided her difficulties. Connie blotted the cheque that was to provide for immediate wants, and laughed sympathetically. "You'll have to learn to be economical, dear. I believe it's quite easy." "You mean I must go in omnibuses and things?" said Norma vaguely, "and not order so many hats and gowns." "I see," said Norma, folding up the cheque. With money again in her pocket, she felt lighter of heart, but she knew that she had stepped for a moment out of fairyland into the grey world of reality. The first experience was unpleasant. It left a haunting dread which made her cling closer to Jimmie in the embrace of their next meeting. It was a relief to get back into the garden of enchantment and leave sordid things outside. Wilfully, she kept the conversation from serious discussion of their marriage. When next she had occasion to go to the studio, she remembered the necessity of economy and took the St. John's Wood omnibus. As a general rule, the travellers between Baker Street Station and the Swiss Cottage are of a superior class, being mostly the well-to-do residents in the neighbourhood and their visitors. But, by an unlucky chance, this particular omnibus was crowded, and Norma found herself wedged between a labouring man redolent of stale beer and bad tobacco, and a fat Jewish lady highly flavoured with musk. A youth getting out awkwardly knacked her hat awry with his elbow. It began to rain, a smart April shower. The wet umbrella of a new arrival dripped on her dress while he stood waiting for a place to be made for him opposite. The omnibus stopped at a shelterless corner, the nearest point to Friary Grove. She descended to pitiless rain and streaming pavements and a 5 minutes' walk, for all of which her umbrella and shoes were inadequate. She vowed miserably a lifelong detestation of omnibuses. She would never enter one again. Cabs were the only possible conveyances for people who could not afford to keep their carriage. She fought down the dread that she might not be able to afford cabs. The Almighty, who had obviously intended her to drive in cabs, would certainly see that his intentions were carried out. She arrived at the studio, wet, bedraggled, and angry, but Jimmie's exaggerated concern disarmed her. It could not have been less had she wandered for miles and been drenched to the skin and chilled to the bone. He sent Aline to fetch her daintier slippers to replace the damp shoes, established the storm-driven sufferer in the big leathern armchair with cushions at her back and hassocks at her feet, made a roaring fire, and insisted on her swallowing cherry brandy, a bottle of which he kept in the house in case of illness. In the unwonted luxury of being loved and petted and foolishly fussed over, Norma again forgot her troubles. Jimmie consoled the specific grievance by saying magnificently that omnibuses were the engines of the devil and vehicles of the wrath to come. With a drugged economic conscience, she went home in a cab. But the conscience awoke later, somewhat suffering, and she recognized that her exasperated vow had been vain. Jimmie was a poor man. She recalled to mind his words on the night of their engagement, and apprehended their significance. The trivial incident of the omnibus was a key. The abandonment of cabs and carriages meant the surrender of countless luxuries that went therewith. Her own 200 a year would not greatly raise the scale of living. She was to be a poor man's wife, would have to wear cheap dresses, eat plain food, keep household books in which pennies were accounted for. Hers would be the humdrum existence of the less prosperous middle class. The first pang of doubt frightened her for a while, and left her ashamed. Noble revolt followed. Had she not renounced the pomps and vanities of a world which she scorned? Had not this wonderful baptism of love brought new birth? She had been reborn, a braver, purer woman. She had been initiated into life's deeper mysteries. Her soul had been filled with joy. Of what count were externals? The next evening, Connie Deering gave a small dinner party in honour of the two engagements. Old Colonel Pawley, charged under pain of her perpetual displeasure not to reveal the secret of Norma's whereabouts, was invited to balance the sexes. He was delighted to hear of Norma's romantic marriage. "I can still present the fan," he said, rubbing his soft palms together, "but I'm afraid I shall have to write a fresh set of verses." "You better give Norma a cookery book," laughed Connie. "I have a beautiful one of my own in manuscript which no publisher will take up," sighed Colonel Pawley. Norma, who had been wont to speak with drastic contempt of the amiable old warrior, welcomed him so cordially that he was confused. He was not accustomed to exuberant demonstrations of friendship from the beautiful Miss Hardacre. At dinner, sitting next to her, he enjoyed himself enormously. Instead of freezing his geniality with sarcastic remarks, she lured him on to the gossip in which his heart delighted. When Connie rallied her, later, on her flirtation with the old man, she laughed. "Remember, I've been a prisoner here. He's one of the familiar faces from outside." Although jestingly, she had spoken with her usual frankness, and her confession was more deeply significant than she was aware at the time. She welcomed Colonel Pauley not for what he was, but for what he represented. As soon as she was alone, she realized the moral lapse and rebuked herself severely. She was sentimental enough to hang by a ribbon around her neck the simple engagement ring which Jimmie had given her, and to sleep with it as a talisman against evil thoughts. She spent the following evening at the studio, heroically enduring the discomforts of the detested omnibus. When she descended, she drew a breath of relief, but felt the glow that comes from virtuous achievement. Jimmie was informed of this practice in the art of economy. He regarded her wistfully. There were times when he too fought with doubts, not of her loyalty, but of his own honesty in bringing her down into his humble sphere. Even now, accustomed as he was to the adored sight of her there, he could not but note the contrast between herself and her surroundings. She brought with her in every detail of her person, in every detail of her dress, in every detail of her manner, an atmosphere of a dainty, luxurious life, pathetically incongruous with the shabby little house. He had not even the wherewithal to call in decorators and upholsterers and make the little house less shabby. So, when she spoke of practising economy, he looked at her wistfully. "Your eyes are open, dear, aren't they?" he said. "You really do realize what a sacrifice you're making in marrying me?" "By not marrying you," she replied, "I should have gained the world and lost my own soul. Now I'm doing the reverse." He kissed her fingertips, lover-wise. "I'm afraid I must be the devil's advocate and say that the loss and gain need not be so absolutely differentiated. I want you to be happy. My God, I want you to be happy!" he burst out with sudden passion. "And if you found that things were infinitely worse than what you had expected, that you had married me in awful ignorance—" She covered his lips with the palm of her hand. "Don't go on. You pain me. You make me despise myself. I've counted the cost, such as it is. Did I not tell you from the first that I would go with you in rags and barefoot through the world? Could woman say more? Don't you believe me?" "Yes, I believe you," he replied, bowing his head. "You are a great-hearted woman." She unfastened her hat, skewered it through with the pins, and gave it to him to put down. "I remember my Solomon," she said, trying to laugh lightly, for there had been a faint but disconcerting sense of effort in her protestation. "Better is a dinner of herbs where love is, than a stalled ox and hatred therewith. Besides, you forget another important matter. I am now a homeless, penniless outcast. I'm not sacrificing anything. It is very kind of you to offer to take me in and shelter me." "There are sophistries," said Jimmie with a laugh. "You gave up all on my account." "But I am really penniless," she said, ignoring his argument. "Anch'io son pittore. I too have the pinch of poverty." "You?" She revealed her financial position, the overdraft at the bank, the shilling between herself and starvation. Were it not for Connie, she would have to sing in the streets. She alluded thoughtlessly, with her class's notions as to the value of money, to her miserable 200 a year. 200 a year? Cried Jimmie. "Why, that's a fortune." His tone struck a sudden chill through her. He genuinely regarded the paltry sum as untold riches. She struggled desperately down to his point of view. "Perhaps it may come in useful for us," she said lamely. "I should think it will. Why didn't you tell me before?" "Have you never thought I might have a little of my own?" she asked, with a touch of her old hardness. "No," said Jimmie, "of course not." "I don't see any of course in the matter. The ordinary man would have speculated it would have been natural, almost common sense." Jimmie threw up its hands deprecatingly. "I have been too much dazzled by the glorious gift of yourself to think of anything else you might bring. I am an impossible creature, as you will find out. I ought to have considered the practical side." "Oh, I am very glad you didn't," she exclaimed. "Heaven forbid you should have the mercenary ideas of the average man. It is beautiful to have thought of me only." "I'm afraid I was thinking of myself, my dear," said he.
I must get out of the way of it and think of the two of us. Now, let us be severely businesslike. You've taken a load off my mind. There are 1,000 things you can surrender yourself with that I imagined you would lack." He took her two hands and swung them backwards and forwards. "Now, I shan't regard myself as such a criminal in asking you to marry me."
"Do you think 200 a year a fortune, Jimmy?"
"To the Rothschilds and Vanderbilts, perhaps not. But everything is relative."
"Everything?"
Her heart spoke suddenly, demanding relief. Their eyes met. "No, dear," he said. "One thing at least is absolute."
An interlude of conviction succeeded doubt. She felt that she had never loved him so much as at that moment. It was more with the quickly lit passion of the awakened woman than with the ardour of a girl that she clasped her hands round his head and drew it down to their kiss. She had an awful need of the assurance of the absolute. It nerved her to face a discussion on ways and means with Aline, whom Jimmy, at her request, summoned from demure sewing in her little drawing-room. "You're right," she had said, referring to his former remark. "We ought to be severely businesslike. I must begin to learn things. You don't know how hopelessly ignorant I am." Aline came down to give the first lesson in elementary housekeeping. She brought with her a pile of little black books which she spread out at the end of the long table. The two girls sat side by side. Jimmy hovered about them for a while, but was soon dismissed by Aline to a distant part of the studio, where, having nothing wherewith to occupy himself, he proceeded to make a charcoal sketch of the two intent faces. Aline, proud of being able to display her housewifely knowledge before appreciative eyes, opened her books and expounded them with a charming business air. These were the receipts for the last 12 months, these the general disbursements. They were balanced to a halfpenny. "Of course anything I can't account for I put down to the item Jimmy," she said naively. "He will go to the money drawer and help himself without letting me know. Isn't it tarson of him?"
Norma smiled absently, wrinkling her brows over the unfamiliar figures. She had no grasp of the relation the amounts of the various items bore to one another, but they all seemed exceedingly small.
"I suppose it's necessary to make up this annual balance?" she asked. "Of course. Otherwise you wouldn't know how much you could apportion to each item. Jimmy says it's nonsense to keep books, but if you listen to Jimmy, you'll have the brokers in a month." "Brokers?"
Aline laughed at her perplexed look.
"Yes, to seize the furniture in payment of debt."
The main financial facts having been stated, Aline came to detail. These were the weekly books from the various tradesmen. She showed a typical week's expenditure.
"What about the fishmonger?" asked Norma, noting an obvious omission. "Oh, fish is too expensive to have regularly," Aline explained, "and so I don't have an account. When I buy any, I pay for it at once, in the shop."
"When you buy it?"
"Why, yes, you'll find it much better to go and choose things for yourself than let them call for orders. Then you can get exactly what you want, instead of what suits the tradesman's convenience. You see, I go to the butcher and look round and say, 'I want a piece of that joint,' and of course he does as he's told. It seems horrid to anyone not accustomed to it to go into a butcher's shop, I know, but really it's not unpleasant, and it's quite amusing."
"But why shouldn't your housekeeper do the marketing?"
"Oh, she does sometimes," Aline admitted, "but Hannah isn't a good buyer. She can't judge meat and things, you know, and she's apt to be wasteful over vegetables."
"You don't bring the meat and things home with you in a basket?" asked Norma, with a nervous laugh.
Jimmy, interested in his sketch, had not listened to the conversation, which had been carried on in a low tone. The last words, however, pitched higher, caught his ear. He jumped to his feet.
"Norma, carry home meat in a basket? Good God, what on earth has the child been telling you?"
"I never said anything of the kind, Jimmy," cried Aline indignantly. "You needn't bring home anything unless you like. Our tradesmen are most obliging."
Norma pushed back her chair from the table and rose, and again laughed nervously.
"I'm afraid I can't learn all the science of domestic economy in one lesson. I must do it by degrees." She passed her hand across her forehead. "I'm not used to figures, you see."
Jimmy looked reproachfully at Aline. "Those horrid little black books," he exclaimed. "They're enough to give anyone a headache. For heaven's sake, have nothing to do with them, dear."
"But the brokers will come in," said Norma, with an uncertain catch in her voice.
"Oh, they are Eline's pet hobgoblins," laughed Jimmie. "My dear child," pointing to the books, "please take those depressing records of wasted hours away." When they were alone, he said to Norma very tenderly, "I'm afraid my little girl has frightened you." She started at the keenness of his perception and flushed. "No, not frightened." "She's so proud of the way she runs her little kingdom here," he said. "So proud to show you how it is done. You must forgive her. She's only a child, my dearest, and forgets that these household delights of hers may come as shocks to you. I shall not allow you to have these worries that she loves to concern her head about." "Then who will have them?" she asked, with her hand on the lapel of his jacket. "You? That would be absurd. If I am your wife, I must keep your house." "My dear," said Jimmie, kissing her, "if we love each other, there will be no possibility of worries. I believe in God in a sort of way, and he has not given you to me to curse and wither your life." "You could only bless and sanctify it," she murmured. "Not I, dear, but our love." Soothed, she raised a smiling face. "But still I'll have to keep house. Do you think I would let you go to the butcher's? What would Aline say if you made such a proposal?" "She would peremptorily forbid him to take my orders," he replied, laughing.
"I am sure I should," she said.
It was growing late. She glanced at the wheezy, tilted old Dutch clock in the corner, and spoke of departure. She reflected for a moment on the means of home-getting. To her lowered spirits the omnibus loomed like a lumbering torture-chamber. The consolation of a cab seemed cowardice. An inspiration occurred to her. She would walk. Perhaps he would accompany her to Bryanston Square. He was enraptured at the suggestion, but could she manage the distance?
"I should like to try. I'm a good walker. And when we are outside," she added softly, "we can talk a little of other matters."
It was a mild spring night, and the quiet stars shone benignantly down upon them as they walked arm in arm and talked of other matters. As she had needed a little while before the assurance of the absolute, so now she craved the spirituality of the man himself, the inner light of faith in the world's beauty, the sweetness, the courage, all that indefinable something in him which raised him and could alone raise her above the terrifying things of earth. She clung to his arm in a pathos of yearning for him to lead her upwards and teach her the things of the spirit. Only thus lay her salvation. He, clean, simple soul, lost in the splendour of their love, expounding as it chanced his guileless philosophy of life and his somewhat childishly pagan religious convictions, was far from suspecting the battle into which he was being called to champion the side of righteousness. He went to sleep that night the most blissfully happy of men. Norma lay awake, a miserable woman. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 27. A Dinner of Herbs. She loved him. Of that there was no doubt. To her he was the man of men. The half-angel, half-fool of her original conception had melted into an heroic figure capable of infinite tendernesses. The lingering barbaric woman in her thrilled at the memory of him contemptuously facing death before the madman's revolver. Her higher nature was awed at the perfect heroism of his sacrifice. She knelt at his feet, recognizing the loftier soul. Sex was stirred to the depths when his arms were about her and his kiss was on her lips. In lighter relations he was the perfect companion. For all her vacillation, let that be remembered, she loved him. All of her that was worth the giving he had in its plenitude. The days which followed her initiation into domestic economy were days of alternating fear and shame and scornful resolution. She lost grip of herself. The proud beauty curving a contumelious lip at the puppet show of life was a creature of the past. Set the proudest and most self-sufficing of women naked in what assembly you please, and she will crouch, helpless, paralyzed, in the furthest corner. Some such denudation of the moral woman had occurred in the case of Norma Hardacre. The old garments were stripped from her. She was bewildered, terrified, no longer endowed with personality.
Sometimes, despising herself and resolved to perform her manifest duty, she sought other lessons from Aline. They ended invariably in dismay. Once she learned that Jimmie had never had a banking account. The money was kept in a drawer of which Jimmie and Aline each had a key. On occasions the drawer had been empty. Another lesson taught her that certain shops in the neighbourhood were to be avoided as being too expensive, that cream was regarded as a luxury, and asparagus as an impossible extravagance. Every new factor in the economy of a poor household caused her to shiver with apprehension. All was so trivial, so contemptibly unimportant, and yet it grew to be a sordid barrier baffling her love. She loathed the base weakness of her nature. It was degrading to feel such repulsion. One evening Connie Deering was going to a Foreign Office reception, and came down an enchanting vision in a new gown from Paquin and exhibited herself to Norma. "I think it's rather a success, don't you?" Norma assented somewhat listlessly, but to please her friend inspected the creation and listened to her chatter. She was feeling lonely and dispirited. At Aline's entreaty she had persuaded Jimmie to go with Tony Merriweather to the Langham Sketch Club, thus showing himself for the first time since the scandal among his old associates. For her altruism she paid the penalty of a dull evening. Their visits to each other were her sole occupation now, all that was left in life to interest her. In moments of solitude she began to feel the appalling narrowness of the circle in which she was caged. Reading tired instead of refreshing her. She had been accustomed to men and women rather than to books, to the sight of many faces, to the constant change of scene. When she speculated on employment for future solitary hours, she thought ruefully of recuffing shirts. Connie apologized for leaving her, hoped she would manage to amuse herself. Norma, who had made strenuous efforts to hide the traces of tumult, returned a smiling answer. Connie, quite deceived, put an arm round her waist, and said suddenly in her bright, teasing way, "Now don't you wish you were coming too?" Norma, staggered at the point-blank question, was mistress enough of herself to observe the decencies of reply, but when Connie had gone, she sat down on the sofa and stared in front of her. She did wish she were going with Connie. She had been wishing vaguely, half-consciously, all the evening. Now the wish was the pain of craving. It came upon her like the craving of the alcoholic subject for drink, this sudden longing for the glitter, the excitement, the whirl of the life she had renounced. Her indictment of it seemed unreal, the confused memory of a brain-sick mood. It was her world. She had not cut herself free. All the fibres of her body seemed to be rooted in it, and she was being drawn thither by irresistible desire. The many, many people, the diamonds, the brilliance, the flattery, the envy, the very atmosphere heavy with many perfumes. She saw and felt it all, panted for it, yearned for it. That never, never again would she take up her birthright was impossible. That she should stand for evermore in the humble street outside the gates of that dazzling, wonderful, kaleidoscopic world was unthinkable. She remembered her talk with Morland at the Duchess of Wiltshire's reception at the end of the last season, her shiver at the idea of a life of poverty. Was it a premonition? She remembered the blessed sense of security when she looked round the splendid scene and felt that she and it were indissoluble parts of the same scheme of things. A crust and heel of cheese as Jimmie's wife had crossed her mind then as a grotesque fantasy. The air of that brilliant gathering was the breath of her being. But now the grotesque fancy was to be the reality. The other was to become the shadow of a dream. No yearning or panting could restore it. The impossible was the inevitable. The unthinkable was the commonplace. She had made her choice deliberately, irrevocably. She had lost the whole world to gain her own soul. In the despair of her mood she questioned the worth of the sacrifice. The finality of the choice oppressed her. If at this 11th hour she could still have the opportunity of the heroic, if still the gates of the world were open to her, she would have had a stimulus to continue nobility. The world and the passionate love for the perfect man. Which would she choose? Her exaltation would still have swept her to the greater choice. Of this she was desperately aware. But the gates were shut. She had already chosen. The heroic moment had gone. The acceptance of conditions was now a mere uninspired duty. She gave way to unreason. "Oh God, why cannot I have both? My own love and my own life?" The tears she shed calmed her. The next day she felt ill from the strain, paying the highly bred woman's penalty of nervous breakdown. Connie Deering noted the circles beneath her eyes and the pinched nostrils. Norma casually mentioned a night's neuralgia. It would pass off during the day. She refused to be doctored. She would pay a visit to Jimmie before lunch. The fresh air would do her good. "The fresh air and Jimmie," laughed her friend. "You are the most beautifully in love young woman I have ever met." Norma started on her visit, walking fast. At Baker Street Station it began to rain. She took the penitential omnibus, but her thoughts were too anxious to concern themselves with its discomforts. Besides, it was almost empty. The night had brought counsel. She would go to Jimmie and be her true self, frank and unsparing. With a touch of her old scorn she had resolved to confess unreservedly all the meanness and cowardice of which she had of late been guilty. She would bear to him the soon-spotted soul and crave his cleansing. He would understand, pardon, and purify. Perhaps when he knew all, he would be able to devise some new scheme of existence. At any rate, she would no longer receive his kisses with a lie in her heart. She loved him too ardently. He should know what she was, what were her needs, her limitations. The meeting would be a crisis in their lives. Out of it would come reconstruction on some unshakable basis. Up to a certain point she reasoned. Beyond it, the pathetic unreason of a woman drifted rudderless. It had stopped raining when she left the omnibus and started on the short walk from the corner to Friary Grove. At the familiar gate her heart already seemed lighter. She opened it, mounted the front steps, and rang. The middle-aged servant, minus cap and with thin, untidy hair, in a soiled print dress, her sleeves rolled up to the elbow, exposing red, coarse arms, was the first shock to Norma when the door opened. "Both the master and Miss Aline are out, miss," said Hannah, with a good-natured smile. "He's gone into town on business, and Miss Aline went out a little while ago with her young man. But they'll be back for lunch. Won't you come in and wait, miss?" Norma, vaguely resenting the familiar address of the servant and her slatternly appearance, hesitated for a moment before deciding to enter. Hannah showed her into the drawing-room and retired. It was a small, dark room looking on to the back. Part of it had been cut off when the house had been altered, so as to construct the studio staircase, which contained one of the original windows. Norma felt strangely ill at ease in the room. The prim, cheap furniture, the threadbare carpet, the flimsy, girlish contrivances of decoration gave the place an air of shabby gentility. The gilt mirror was starred with spots and had a crack across the corner. Some of Jimmie's socks and underwear lay on the table for mending. They were much darned, and fresh holes could not fail to meet the eye that rested momentarily on the pile. To mend these would in the future be her duty. She took up an undervest shrinkingly and shook it out, then folded it again and closed her eyes. She could not wait there. The gloom depressed her. The studio would be brighter and more familiar. She went downstairs. Nothing in the room she knew so well was changed, yet it seemed to wear a different aspect. The homely charm had vanished. Here, too, shabbiness and poverty stared at her. The morning light streaming through the great high window showed pitilessly the cracks and stains and missing buttons of the old leathern suite, and the ragged holes in the squares of old carpet laid upon the boards. It was a mere bleak workshop, not a room for human habitation. The pictures on the walls and easels ceased to possess decorative or even intimate value. The large picture of the faun that had exercised so great an influence upon her had been dispatched to its purchaser, and in its place was a hopeless gap. She sat down in her accustomed chair, and once more strove to realize the future. There would be children who would need her care. On herself would all the sordid burdens fall. She saw herself a soured woman, worn with the struggle to make ends meet, working with her hands at menial tasks. The joy of life! She laughed mirthlessly. She rose, walked restlessly about the studio, longing for Jimmie to come and exorcise the devils that possessed her. A little sharp cry of distress escaped her lips. The place echoed like a vault, and she felt awfully alone. In her nervous tension she could bear it no longer. She went up the stairs again into the bare hall. On the pegs hung 2 or 3 discoloured hats and an old coat. Scarce knowing whither she went, she entered the dining-room. Luncheon had been laid. A freak of destiny had reproduced the meal of which Morland had spoken at Wiltshire House, and of which last night had revived the memory. A scrag end of cold boiled mutton, blackened and shapeless, with the hard suet round about it. A dried-up heel of yellow American cheese, the half of a cottage loaf. The tablecloth, it was Friday, was stained with the week's meals. It was coarse in texture, old and thin and darned. The enamel on the plates was cracked, the 100 tiny fissures showing up dark brown. The plate on the forks had worn off in places, disclosing the yellowish metal beneath. The tumblers were thick and common, of glass scarcely transparent. She stared helplessly at the table. Never in her life had she seen such preparations for a meal. To the woman always daintily fed, daintily environed, it seemed squalor unspeakable. She shrank back into the hall, pressed her hands to her eyes, looked round as if to search for some refuge. The stairs met her eye. She had never seen what lay above the ground floor, except once, on the memorable evening when Aline had fainted. Suddenly madness seized her, an insane craving to spy out the whole nakedness of the house. The worn stair-carpet ended at the first landing. Then bare boards. The door of the bathroom was wide open. She peeked in. The ceiling was blackened with gas. The bath cracked and stained, the appointments as bare as those in a workhouse. Her glance fell upon a battered tin dish, holding an uncompromising cube of yellow soap with hard, sharp edges. She withdrew her head and shut the door hurriedly. Another door stood ajar. She pushed it open and entered. It was the front bedroom, inhabited by Jimmie. The thought that it would be her own, which a fortnight before might have clothed her in delicious confusion, chilled her to the bone. Bare boards again, a strip of oilcloth by the narrow, cheap iron bedstead, a painted deal table with a little mirror and the humblest of toilette equipment laid upon it, a painted deal chest of drawers with white handles, a painted deal washstand, a great triangular bit broken out of the mouth of the ewer. It was poverty, grinding, sordid, squalid poverty. From the one dishevelled, slatternly, middle-aged servant to the cheap paper peeling off the wall in the bedrooms, all she had seen was poverty. The gathering terror of it burst like a thunderstorm above her head. Her courage failed her utterly. Like a creature distracted, she rushed downstairs and fled from the house. She walked homewards with an instinctive sense of direction. Afterwards she had little memory of the portion of the road she traversed on foot. She moved in a shuddering nightmare. All the love in the world could not shed a glamour over the nakedness of the existence that had now been revealed to her in its entire crudity. She could not face it. Other women of gentle birth had forsaken all and followed the men they loved. They had loved peasants and had led great-heartedly the peasant's life. They had qualities of soul that she lacked. Hideously base, despicably cowardly she knew herself to be. It was her nature. She could not alter. The world of graceful living was her world. In the other she would die. He had warned her. The gypsy faith in Providence had made him regard as a jest what would be to her a sordid shift, an intolerable ugliness, stripping life of its beauty. The passion-flower could not thrive in the hedge with the dog-rose. It was true, mercilessly true. The craving of last night awoke afresh, imperiously insistent. She walked blindly, tripped and nearly fell. Her subconscious self hailed a passing hansom and gave the address. What would become of her, she knew not. She thought wildly of suicide as the only possible escape. From her own world she was outcast. Her gates were barred with gold and opened but to golden keys. She was penniless. In this other world she would die. Love could not prevent her starving on its diet of herbs. She clung to life, to the stalled ox, and recked little of the hatred. But at the banquet she no longer had a seat. She had said she would follow him in rags and barefoot over the earth. She had not fingered the rags when she had made the senseless vow. She had not tried her tender feet on the stones. She could have shrieked with terror at the prospect. There was no way out but death. The garden of enchantment faded from her mind like a forgotten dream. The sweet Arcadian make-believe alone rose up in ironical mockery, a scathing memory which seemed to flay the living heart of her. She sat huddled together in a corner of the cab, tortured and desperate. On either hand hung the doom of death. In the one case it would be lingering. The soul would die first. The man she loved would be tied to a living corpse. She would be a devastating curse to him instead of a blessing. In the other, she could leave him in the fullness of their unsullied love. The years that the locust hath eaten would not stretch an impassable waste between them. In his sorrow there would be the imperishable sense of beauty, and for herself the quick end were better. She was aroused to consciousness of external things by a husky voice addressing her from somewhere above her head. The cab had stopped at Connie's house in Bryanston Square. She descended, handed to the man the first coin in her purse that her fingers happened to grasp. He looked at it, said that he was sorry he had not change for a sovereign. She waved her hand vaguely, deaf to his words. The cabman, with a clear conscience, whipped up his horse smartly and drove off. A figure on the doorstep raised his hat. "How delightful of you to arrive at the very moment, Miss Hardacre. I am summoned back to America. I sail tomorrow. I was calling on the chance of being able to bid you good-bye." Norma collected her scattered wits and recognized Theodore Weaver. She looked at him full in the eyes. Her lips were parted. Her breath came fast. He stretched out his hand to press the electric button so as to gain admittance to the house. She touched his arm, restraining his action, and still stared at him. "Wait," she said at last. "I have something to say to you." "I am honoured," he replied in his imperturbable way. "Have you found your decorative wife, Mr. Weaver?" A sudden light shone lambently in his pale, expressionless blue eyes. "Am I to understand that I can find her on Mrs. Deering's doorstep?" "If you look hard enough," said Norma. He took her hand and shook it with the air of a man concluding a bargain. "I felt sure of it," he said. "I intended from the first to marry you. I shall ever be your most devoted servant." "I make one condition," she said. "Name it." "You don't enter this house, and I sail with you tomorrow." "Certainly." "What train shall I catch, and from what station shall I start?" "The 10 o'clock from Waterloo." She rang the bell. "May I trouble you to book my passage?" "It will be my happiness." "Au revoir," she said, holding out her hand. He raised his hat and walked away briskly. The door opened, and Norma entered the house. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Where Love Is by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 28. The Word of Aline. What she wrote to him is no great matter. Her letter, which he opened on coming down to breakfast the next morning, filled many pages. It was a rhapsody of passionate love and self-abasement, with frantic appeals for forgiveness. In its cowardice there was something horribly piteous. Jimmie read it beneath the high north window of the studio, his back turned towards Aline, who was seated at the breakfast table at the other end. For a long, long while he stood there, quite still, holding the letter in his hand. Aline, in wonder, stole up quietly and touched his arm. When he turned, she saw that his face was ashen grey, like a dead man's. The shock left its mark upon him. Physically it accomplished the work of 10 years, wiping the youth from his face and setting in its stead the seal of middle age. It is common enough for grief or illness to lay its hand on the face of a woman no longer young, and shrivel up her beauty like a leaf and set her free, old and withered. But with a man, who has no such beauty to be marred, the case is rare. For a week he remained silent. The two women who loved him waited in patience until the time should come for their comforting to be of use. From the very first morning he let no change appear in his habits, but set his palette as usual, and went on with the new picture that was nearing completion. In the afternoon he went for a walk. Aline, going down to the studio, happened to look at his morning's work. For a moment she was puzzled by what she saw, for she was familiar with his methods. Gradually the solution dawned upon her. He'd been painting meaninglessly, incoherently, putting in splotches of colour that had no relation to the tone of the picture, crudely accentuating outlines, daubing here, there, and anywhere with an aimless brush. It was the work of a child or a drunken man. Aline cast herself on the model platform and cried till she could cry no more. When he came back he took a turpentine rag and obliterated the whole picture. For days he worked incessantly, trying in vain to repaint. Nothing would come right. The elementary technique of his art seemed to have left him. Aline strove to get him away. He resisted. He had to do his day's work, he said. "But you're not well, dear," she urged. "You will kill yourself if you go on like this."
"I've never heard of work killing a man," he answered. Then after a pause, "No, it's not work that kills."
At last the sleep that had failed him returned, and he awoke one morning free from the daze in the brain against which he had been obstinately struggling. He rose and faced the world again with clear eyes. When Aline entered the studio to summon him to lunch, she found him painting at the unhappy picture with his accustomed sureness of touch. He leaned back and surveyed his handiwork.
"It's going to be magnificent, isn't it? What a blessing I wiped out the first attempt."
"Yes, this is ever so much better, Jimmie," the girl replied, with tears very near her eyes. But her heart swelled with happy relief. The aching strain of the past week was over. She had dreaded breakdown, illness, and permanent paralysis of his faculties. The man she knew and loved had seemed to be dead, and his place taken by a vacant-eyed simulacrum. Now he had come to life again, and his first words sounded the eternal chord of hope and faith. From that day onwards he gave no sign of pain or preoccupation. Only the stamp of middle age upon his face betrayed the suffering through which he had passed. He concerned himself about Aline's marriage. Arrangements had been made for it to take place on the same day as that of their elders, a day, however, that Norma had never fixed. The recent catastrophe had caused its indefinite postponement. Aline declared herself to be in the same position as before, the responsibility of the beloved's welfare being again thrust upon her shoulders. She pleaded with her lover for delay, and young Merryweather, disappointed though he was, acquiesced with good grace. At last Jimmie called them before him, and, waving his old bra-root pipe as he spoke, delivered his ultimatum.
"My dear children," said he, standing up before them as they sat together on the rusty sofa, "you have the two greatest and most glorious things in a great and glorious world, youth and love. Don't despise the one and waste the other. Get all the beauty you can out of life, and you'll shed it on other people. You'll shed it on me. That's why I want you to marry as soon as ever you are ready. You'll let me come and look at you sometimes, and if you are happy together, as God grant you will be, that will be my great happiness, the greatest I think that earth has in store for me. I've stood between you long enough. All that is over. I shall miss my little girl, Tony. I should be an inhuman monster if I didn't. But I should be a monster never before imagined by a disordered brain if I found any pleasure in having her here to look after me when she ought to be living her life in fullness. And that's the very end of the matter. I speak selfishly. I can't help it. I have a great longing for joy around me once more. Go upstairs and settle everything finally between you."
When they had gone, he sighed.
"Yes," he said to himself, "a great longing for joy, and the sound of the steps of little children."
Then he laughed, calling himself a fool, and went on with his painting. A day or two afterwards, Connie Deering, who had been a frequent visitor since Norma's flight, walked into the studio while Jimmie was working. "Don't let me disturb you. Please go on," she cried in her bright, airy way. "If you don't, I'll disappear. I've only come for a gossip." Jimmie drew a chair near the easel and resumed his brush. She congratulated him on the picture. It was shaping beautifully. She'd been talking about it last night to Lord Hyston, who promised to call at the studio to inspect it. Lord Hyston was a well-known buyer of modern work. "He is stocking a castle in Wales which he never goes near, with acres of paint," she said encouragingly. "So I don't see why you shouldn't have a look in."
"Is there a family ghost in the castle?"
"I believe there are two."
"That's a blessing," said Jimmie. "Someone, at any rate, will look at the pictures."
She watched him in silence for a minute or two. Then she came to the important topic. "So the two children have made up their minds at last?"
"Yes, they are to be married on the 28th of May.
"Poor young things," said Connie.
"Why poor?"
"I don't know," she said with a sigh. "The subject of marriage always makes me sad nowadays. I'm growing old and pessimistic."
"You are bewilderingly youthful," replied Jimmie.
"Do you know how old I am?"
"I've forgotten how to do subtraction," he said, thinking of his own age.
"Yes, of course you know. It's awful. And Aline is what, 17?
18.
You'll be dreadfully lonely without her."
"Lonely? Oh, no. I have my thoughts and my memories."
She looked at him fleetingly. "I should have thought you would wish to escape from memories, Jimmie."
"Why should I?"
"The sorrow's crown of sorrows?"
"I don't believe in it," he said, turning towards her. "What has been has been. A joy that once has been is imperishable. Remembering happier things is a sorrow's crown of consolation. Thank God I have had them to remember."
"Do you think she is finding consolation in memories?" She spoke with sudden heat, for Norma's conduct had filled her heart with blazing indignation.
"I hope so," said Jimmie dreamily, after a pause. "But she has not so many as I. She loved me deeply. She had her hour, but I had my day."
"If I were you, I should want never to think of her again."
"Not if you were I, my dear Connie," he said gently. "If either of us was in the wrong, it was not she."
"Rubbish," said Mrs. Deering.
"No, it is the truth. She was made for kings' palaces and not for this sort of thing. I knew it was impossible from the first, but the joy and wonder of it all blinded my eyes. She gave me the immortal part of herself. It is mine for all eternity. I wrote to her a day or two ago. I was not able at first. I could not sleep, you know. Something seemed to have gone wrong with my head."
"You wrote to her?"
"To tell her not to be unhappy for my sake."
"And you have forgiven her entirely?"
"Since our love is unchanged, how could I do otherwise?"
"But she's gone and thrown herself into the arms of another man, and such a man," said Connie brusquely. A quiver of pain passed over his face.
"There are things of the flesh that the discipline of life teaches a man to subdue. I think I am man enough for that. The others are things of the spirit. If ever woman loved a man, she loved me. I thank God," he added in a low voice, "that she realized the impossibility before we were married."
"So do I, devoutly," said Connie.
"It would have made all the difference."
"Precisely," said Connie.
"She would have been chained hand and foot to an intolerable existence. She would have fretted and pined. Her life would have been an infinite burden. Heaven's mercy saved her."
"I wasn't looking at it from her point of view at all," exclaimed Connie.
"Hers is the only one from which one can look at it," he answered gravely.
When she bade him good-bye some 10 minutes later, she did not withdraw the hand which he held. Her forget-me-not eyes grew pleading, and her voice trembled a little. "I wish I could comfort you, Jimmie. Not only now, but in the lonely years to come. But remember, dear, there is nothing on earth I wouldn't give you or do for you. Nothing on earth." It was not till long afterwards that he fully comprehended the meaning of her words, and then she herself prettily vouchsafed the interpretation. For immediate answer he kissed her on the cheek in the brotherly fashion in which he had kissed her twice before.
"What greater comfort," said he, "can I have than to hear you say that? I am a truly enviable man, Connie. Love and affection are showered upon me in full measure. Life is very, very sweet."
The next 2 or 3 weeks brought pleasant surprises which strengthened his conviction. One by one, Old friends sought him out, and some heartedly, others shamefacedly, extended to him the hand of brotherhood. His evening at the Langham Sketch Club had inaugurated the new order of things. The Fruin Smiths, whose New Year party had marked the epoch between child and woman in Aline's life, invited the two outcasts to dinner, and pointedly signified that they were the honoured guests. Brother artists looked in casually on Sunday evenings. Their wives called upon Aline, offering congratulations and wedding gifts. A lady whose portrait he had painted, and at whose house he had visited, commissioned him to paint the portraits of her two children. The ostracism had been removed. How this had been effected Jimmie could not conjecture, and Tony Merriweather and Connie Deering, who were the persons primarily and independently responsible, did not enlighten him. By Aline's wedding day all the old circle had gathered round him, and a whisper of the true story had been heard in Wiltshire House. Then the world began to smile upon him, as if to make amends for the anguish it could not remedy. He took the smile as a proof of the world's essential goodness. The great glory that for a day had made his life a blaze of splendour had faded. The sun in his heaven had been eternally eclipsed. But the lesser glory of the moon and stars remained undimmed. The tenderness of twilight lost no tone of its beauty. He stood unshaken in its faith, unchanged in himself, the strong, wise man looking upon the earth and the fullness thereof with the unclouded eyes of a child. The man whom he had most loved, the woman he had most worshipped, had each failed him, had each brought upon him bitter and abiding sorrow. They had passed like dead folks out of his daily life. Yet each retained in his heart the once inhabited chambers. They were dear ghosts. His incurable optimism in this wise brought about its consolation, for optimism involves courage of a serene quality. Aline, with her swift perception of him, had the opportunity of flashing this into an epigram. There was a little gathering in the studio, and the talk ran on personal bravery. Someone started the question, what would the perfectly brave man do if attacked unarmed by a man-eating tiger? "I know what Jimmie would do," she cried. "He would try to pat the beast on the head." There was laughter over the girl's unchallenged championship, but those who had ears to hear found the saying true. The night before the wedding, the two sat up very late, spending their last hours together, and Aline sat like a child on Jimmie's knee and sobbed on his breast. The lover seemed a far-away abstraction, a malevolent force rather than a personality that was tearing her away from the soil in which her life was rooted. Jimmie stroked her hair and spoke brave words, but he had not realized till then the wrench of parting. Till then perhaps neither had realized the strength of the bond between them. They were both fervent natures who felt intensely, and their mutual affection had been a vital part of their lives. If bright and gallant youth had not flashed across the girl's path, and, after the human way, had not caught her wondering maidenhood in strong young arms, if deeper and more tragic passion had not swept away the mature man, it is probable that this rare, pure love of theirs might have insensibly changed into the greater need one of the other, and the morrow's bells might have rung for these two. But as it was, no such impulse stirred their exquisite relationship. They were father and daughter without the barrier of paternity, brother and sister without the ties of consanguinity, lovers without the lover's throb, intimate, passionate friends with the sweet and subtle magic of the sex's difference. "I can't bear leaving you," she moaned. "I can't bear leaving the dear, beautiful life. I'll think of you every second of every minute of every hour, sitting here all alone. Alone. I don't want to go. If you say the word now, I'll remain, and it shall be as it has been for ever and ever."
"I shall miss you terribly, my dear," said he, "but I'll be the gainer in the end. You'll give me Tony as a sort of younger brother. I'm getting to be an old man, darling, and soon I shall find the need of leisure in my painting life. You can't understand that yet. Tony will bring around me the younger generation with new enthusiasm for fresh impulses. It is to my very great good, dear. And if God gives you children, I'll be the only grandfather they'll ever have, poor things, and I'd like to have a child about me again. I have experience. I've washed your chubby face and hands, moi qui vous parle. and undressed you and put you to bed, my young lady who is about to be married."
"Oh, Jimmie, I remember it, and I had to tell you how to do everything."
"It seems the day before yesterday," said Jimmie.
"Eheu fugaces." The next day, when she in her wedding dress, a present from Connie Deering, walked down the aisle on her husband's arm and stole a shy glance at him, radiant, full of the promise and the pride of manhood, and met the glad love in his eyes, she forgot all else in the throbbing joy of her young life's completion. It was only afterwards, when she was changing her dress, with Connie Deering's assistance, in her own little room, that she became again conscience-stricken. "You will look after Jimmie while I'm away, won't you?" she asked tragically. They were going to the Isle of Wight for their honeymoon. "I would look after him altogether, if he would let me," said Connie, in an abrupt, emotional little outburst. Aline drew a quick breath. "What do you mean?" Connie threw the simple travelling hat, whose feathers she was daintily touching, upon the bed. "What do you think I mean?" She laughed nervously. "I'm not an old woman. I'm as lonely as Jimmie will be, and—" "What?" "Oh, only I found that I love Jimmie as much as a silly woman can love anybody, if it's any satisfaction to you to know it, and you may be quite sure that I'll see no harm comes to him during your honeymoon, dear." The ensuing conversation nearly caused the bride to miss her train, but no bride ever left her girlhood's room more luminously happy. On the threshold she turned and threw her arms round Connie Deering's neck. "I'll arrange it all when I come back," she whispered. And Aline kept her word. End of chapter 28. End of Where Love Is by William John Locke.